Mushing Radio presents the 1925 Serum Run, a limited series. Part 1, Nome. At nights, the dogs would howl, a single howl that made others join in, building to a crescendo of what locals referred to as the Malamute chorus. For centuries, doctors could do nothing to help those suffering from diphtheria. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. They knew that locating the antitoxin wouldn't solve their problems. They still needed to figure out how to get it to Nome. A dog sled relay. One team could start in Nome heading east, and the other could start in Nenana near Fairbanks heading west. They would meet in the middle at Nulato. The 1925 Serum Run, only on Mushing Radio. Available on Apple Podcasts and everywhere you get your podcasts. Nome. Even the name sounds distant and a little mysterious. There are several theories about what the name Nome means. Some say it was named by Japhet Lindenberg, one of the so-called Three Lucky Swedes, after the Nome Valley near where he was from in Norway. Never mind that Lindenberg was Norwegian and not Swedish. Everyone from Nome knows what it means for him to be a lucky Swede. Others say it was the result of misreading a mark on a map by a British naval officer on a trip to explore the Bering Sea. A question mark, followed by the word name, was misread as C for Cape and the word no, Cape No. Still others say it's a mispronunciation of the local Inupiaq word nyami, meaning where. Take your pick. All those explanations are fanciful, a little hard to believe, far out of the ordinary for a place that's far out of the ordinary. But no matter where the name comes from, this is far away, an outpost near the top of the world, right on the edge of the Bering Sea. No roads in, no roads out. Not much useful soil or tree cover to save you from the cold winter winds. Siberia is just 55 miles away. The international date line is out there, a few miles off the coast, so some people will tell you that from Nome, you can literally see tomorrow. In 1925, supplies came in by boat from Seattle, nearly 2,500 miles and 2 weeks' journey south. So the supplies would come in during the summer, because it was only from July through early October that the ice was clear and the ships could even get there. The entire area is and was subject to the whim of the winters. To understand Nome, we need to go back to 1898 and the Three Lucky Swedes, because that summer Japhet Lindenberg from Norway and 2 Swedish immigrants, Eric Lindblom and John Bryntesen, found gold on Anvil Creek. Word spread quickly, and rumors even more quickly than that. Rumors that greatly exaggerated the amount of gold because, well, that's what people wanted to believe. In 1899, there were suddenly 10,000 people living in Nome. By June 1900, more than 1,000 people a day were arriving in Nome to seek their fortunes. At its height, more than 20,000 people lived there. Since the beach had been declared public property, you didn't need to stake a claim to search for gold in Nome. So many people would come off the boats, walk down the beach, and start searching for the nuggets they were sure were there. A few got lucky. More found little more than dust. And like any good gold rush, many found nothing of value at all. But gold rushes bring with them a need for supplies. There's an old saying that the people who get really rich in a gold rush are the ones supplying the shovels. And in Nome in the early 1900s, there was a seemingly limitless demand for shovels and mining equipment and tents. And with that demand came a demand for booze and entertainment and ladies of the evening. The glory days of the Wild West may have passed in the lower 48, but up in Alaska, there was still a feeling of lawlessness. So it was with great fanfare that gunslinger Wyatt Earp, best known for the gunfight at the OK Corral, moved to Nome and became an owner of Dexter's Saloon. For a few years, things were hopping at what was then the northernmost town in America. And yes, there were dogs. Many residents had their own dog teams, and dogs outnumbered people in most years. The town government passed a law that's still officially on the books, requiring dogs to wear bells in town so that they wouldn't be hazardous to people who were out walking. At nights, the dogs would howl, a single howl that made others join in, building to a crescendo of what locals referred to as the Malamute chorus. And a bunch of locals figured out that the best thing was a grand dog race called the All-Alaska Sweepstakes, a 408-mile trek out to Candle and back through punishing landscape and crossing the Continental Divide twice. The first race was held in 1908, and it was an annual event until 1917, when World War I put an end to it. Each April, Nome would bring in thousands of mushing fans, and the town billed itself as the dog capital of the world. In addition, explorers, adventurers, and those who just wanted guides for northern expeditions flocked to Nome because they knew they could find the best dogs and the best dogmen. But all booms eventually go bust, and so it was with the gold rush in Nome. By 1910, the population had dropped to 2,500. There were other places to try to find gold, warmer places, places that were easier to reach. And then World War I threw the economy of Alaska into chaos. Without the All-Alaska Sweepstakes and without the prospect of gold, most who'd come for the boom years left. During boom times, there was a lot of construction. But by 1920, many of the buildings that had gone up during the gold rush time were empty or falling apart. And when a big fire in 1905 and a violent storm in 1913 destroyed many of the gold rush era buildings, there was a feeling that there wasn't really a strong need to rebuild them. By 1925, the population was under 1,400, reported by the local government as 975 whites and 455 natives or mixed-race residents. The town doctor was Curtis Welch, a 50-year-old Connecticut native who'd spent 18 years in Alaska. He was the only doctor within 100 miles, and he ran a 25-bed hospital and had 4 nurses working with him there. The great influenza pandemic of 1918 was still fresh in Dr. Welch's memory. More than 500 million people around the world were affected, and millions died, including 675,000 in the U.S. Welch had been powerless to do much during the flu pandemic. 72 of 80 residents in nearby Teller, Alaska, 71 miles north of Nome, died from the flu over the span of 5 days in November 1918. Many villages lost half their populations, and some were wiped out altogether. Quarantines were put into place. Rescuers set out from Nome to remote villages, often on dog sleds. Welch himself missed the signs of the pandemic. He had put some crewmen and longshoremen under quarantine in October 1918 when they came in complaining of sore throats. But he decided after 5 days to lift the quarantine, thinking the crew members were just suffering from bad colds or maybe tonsillitis, but nothing serious, nothing worse. Days later, people died, including a hospital worker. Nome government officials rushed to quarantine the entire city, but by then the flu had spread throughout northwestern Alaska. It was just 6 years later that patients began appearing in Nome again with bad coughs, some perhaps suffering from tonsillitis. Things got bad in the fall and early winter, but things sometimes get bad in the fall and early winter, and there didn't seem to be any serious reason to panic. Welch treated one little girl on Christmas Eve and prescribed bed rest for her. On December 28th, he received word that she'd died. He wanted to perform an autopsy, but her parents refused to grant permission. He wrote that deaths from tonsillitis were rare, but they did happen occasionally, so he didn't give it too much thought. Then, in early January of 1925, 2 more children died after complaining of severe sore throats. On January 20th, Dr. Welch examined Billy Barnett, a 3-year-old boy who'd been admitted to the hospital a week earlier with fever, swollen glands, and a sore throat. That day, Billy had a new symptom: gray bloody lesions in his throat and nasal membrane. These were the symptoms of diphtheria, a bacteria sometimes referred to as the strangler. Diphtheria is an airborne bacteria that releases a toxin that makes those who have the disease extremely tired. It weakens the immune system, and in a matter of days, lesions grow and multiply, filling the mouth, the nasal cavity, and moving down the windpipe, making it difficult and painful to breathe. Eventually, the lesions make it impossible for air to get to the lungs, and those suffering from diphtheria die of what seems to be strangulation. For centuries, doctors could do nothing to help those suffering from diphtheria. But the good news is that medical science had made great strides, and by the turn of the 20th century, an antitoxin was developed. The even better news was that Dr. Welch had some of that antitoxin in Nome. But there was also bad news. Dr. Welch didn't have enough antitoxin to deal with a full-scale epidemic, and the limited amount that he had was old. Since he wasn't 100% positive of Billy Barnett's diagnosis, Welch decided not to give him the antitoxin because he was worried there might be side effects that would harm Billy in his already weakened state. Welch had no experience with diphtheria and wasn't sure that the lesions he'd seen were definite indications of the disease. A throat culture would have confirmed the diagnosis, but sadly, Welch also had little experience with throat cultures. And while his hospital was the best around, it had no laboratory, no facilities for incubating cultures, and a supply of electricity that frequently failed and could never be relied upon. So Dr. Welch and his nurses kept their suspected diagnosis secret, not wanting to create a panic in Nome. They gave Billy alternate treatments that seemed to help him for a few hours. But later that evening, Billy's windpipe became blocked by the lesions, and Welch could do little besides try to make him comfortable as he died. Dr. Welch knew he needed fresh antitoxin and plenty of it. The native Eskimo population would be at greatest risk, since they had little resistance to bacteria and viruses brought in by sailors or travelers who came to Nome on ships. Eskimos also were superstitious about the spirit of death, and many worried that if someone died in their home, death would spot them and claim them next. Dr. Welch worried that the native population might panic and try to flee, which would further spread the disease. When another native girl, Bessie Stanley, had the same type of lesions, Dr. Welch injected her with the aging antitoxin on January 21, 1925. But he got to her too late, and the antitoxin wasn't as effective as it had been. Bessie died hours later. That evening, Dr. Welch contacted Nome Mayor George Maynard, who also published the Nome Nugget, the local newspaper. Dr. Welch explained what was happening and what he feared would happen next if they couldn't get fresh antitoxin. In an emergency town council meeting, the council voted to implement a quarantine and appointed Emily Morgan, one of Welch's nurses at the hospital, as quarantine nurse for Nome. Maynard printed up flyers describing the situation and urging residents to stay at home. The next day, January 22, 1925, Welch sent out 2 telegrams. The first went to every major city and town in Alaska and to the territorial governor, describing the situation in Nome. The second telegram went to the U.S. Public Health Service, the government agency in charge of producing antitoxins and vaccines. This second telegram was relatively simple, and it said in part, "An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop." On January 24th, Dora and Mary Stanley, sisters of Bessie Stanley, who had died 3 days earlier, also died from diphtheria. Dr. Welch and nurse Emily Morgan conducted a survey of the local population and discovered 20 more confirmed cases of diphtheria and 50 more residents who were considered at serious risk. The local Board of Health called an emergency meeting. They knew that locating the antitoxin wouldn't solve their problems. They still needed to figure out how to get it to Nome. At the meeting, Mayor Maynard proposed flying the antitoxin in by bush plane, but it was 1925 and airplane technology was very primitive and quite limited. The only planes that were thought able to fly to Nome in the winter were World War I vintage J-1 biplanes. There were several problems with this idea. First, these planes had open cockpits and water-cooled engines. so they were not generally used in winter when temperatures would go far below freezing. Second, the actual planes in question had been dismantled for the winter and would have to be reassembled and tested before they could fly. Third, and most important, the two pilots who were the most expert in flying those planes were not even in Alaska at the time. Dan Sutherland, the delegate from the Alaska Territory to the U.S. Congress, pushed to have inexperienced pilot Ray Darling fly the plane. The Board of Health vetoed that idea as too risky. Then, at the meeting, board member Mark Summers announces he has a better idea. He pauses for a moment and the board can hear the sound of dogs howling outside in the distance. Summers, who runs the Hammond Consolidated Goldfields, a company that owns several smaller gold mining companies, including the Pioneer Gold Mining Company started by the three Lucky Swedes themselves, proposes a dog sled relay. One team could start in Nome heading east, and the other could start in Nenana near Fairbanks heading west. They would meet in the middle at Nulato, pass the antitoxin from musher to musher, and have the team from Nome turn around and head back. In fact, Summers says, he knows the perfect man to run from Nome to Nulato and back. A man who works for Summers and who won the All-Alaska Sweepstakes 3 years in a row, legendary musher Leonhard Seppala. The Board of Health unanimously votes for the dog sled relay. Now, all they need to do is locate enough antitoxin. The call went out. Within days, the story would capture the attention of people all over the world. Men, women, and dogs would mobilize to address the urgent need of the people in Nome in what would come to be known as the 1925 Serum Run, which would test the strength and determination of all involved in ways they could not yet imagine. But all of that would come later. That wasn't something Dr. Curtis Welch was thinking about that night. As he walked home from the Board of Health meeting, and the sound of howling dogs spread from doglot to doglot, from one end of town to the other, echoing against the ice in the Bering Sea, he wasn't thinking about any of that. For Curtis Welch, the issue was much simpler. Haunted by the deadly effects of the flu pandemic a few years earlier and his role in making a mistake that might have caused additional deaths, Dr. Welch knew he was facing the start of a new and potentially more deadly epidemic, and the only thing he was interested in was saving lives. And that meant finding a way to hold on until help could get there. Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome noticed an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determined that the cause was diphtheria, a bacterial infection that causes gray lesions in the mouth and throat that eventually make it impossible to breathe. The Nome Board of Health declared a quarantine and sent out an urgent plea for antitoxin to be sent to Nome. Because of the severe weather, it was decided that the best way to bring the antitoxin in was to have 2 dog teams start at opposite ends of the state and meet in the middle. The team from Nome would then turn around and rush back with the antitoxin. This week, the dogs start to run. The plan is for antitoxin to arrive in Anchorage, be taken by train up to Nenana near Fairbanks, and put on a dog sled going west. It's 674 miles from Nenana to Nome. According to the plan approved by Nome's Board of Health, the handoff would take place in Nulato, 319 miles away from Nome. This means a musher would travel 319 miles from Nome to Nulato, get the antitoxin, turn around, and drive his dogs another 319 miles back. Mark Summers, who owns several gold mining companies, says he knows just the man to make that 638-mile trip. And luckily, that man works for him. Leonhard Seppala, legendary musher of Siberian Huskies and the winner of the last 3 All-Alaska Sweepstakes, is told to get his dogs ready. Seppala, who'd arrived in Nome as part of the gold rush in 1900, is a relatively small man. He stands 5'4" and weighs in at about 145 pounds. This makes him ideal for standing on the runners behind a dog sled. And while other mushers consider 40 miles a day a good distance to go, Seppala and his team of Huskies often run 50 or even 100 miles a day. He claims he ran 7,000 miles one winter on a dog sled. Seppala, a natural showman and great athlete, sometimes walks down Front Street in Nome on his hands, showing off for the local kids. Seppala's kennel includes 36 Siberian Huskies. He says those are the only dogs that are strong and sturdy enough. He plans to take 20 to Nulato. Seppala is also known for his innovation in training dogs. He's one of the first mushers to train dogs by having them pull carts in the summers, a practice still common today. From 1915 to 1917, Seppala totally dominated dog sled races. His dogs exhibited the type of strength and stamina his competitors could only dream of, and he had a legendary rapport with the dogs that led some to question whether he'd somehow hypnotized them into doing what he wanted. But others feel that Seppala's glory days are behind him. His lead dog for the last All-Alaska victories, a Siberian Husky named Togo, is now 12 years old, considered well past his prime for a leader. But Seppala and Togo are fiercely devoted to one another. Even in 1925, Togo knows exactly what Seppala is thinking and can do things that seem at first to be impossible. Many of the best and most successful mushers in the modern era have emulated different aspects of Seppala's personality, and it's not at all a stretch to see Seppala-like traits in mushers as different today as Jeff King, Dallas and Mitch Seavey, and Lance Mackey. Word comes in from Anchorage that 300,000 units of antitoxin are at a hospital and can be sent to Nome. It's not the 1 million units Dr. Welch wanted, but it will be a good start and could be enough to keep the disease at bay until more can be sent. Federal officials locate another 1.1 million units up and down the West Coast. Those doses are sent to Seattle, where they can be brought north by boat and hopefully make it to Alaska by the end of January. Alaska's territorial representative to the U.S. Congress, Fighting Dan Sutherland, tries to rally bush pilots to see if any could fly the antitoxin to Nome. But at the same time, Dr. John Beeson, chief surgeon at the Anchorage hospital that has the 300,000 units of antitoxin, asks Alaska's territorial governor, Scott Bone, if the antitoxin can be transported on dog sleds. This would take advantage of a dog sled infrastructure that is already used successfully to transport mail into the bush. More importantly, Beeson himself has first-hand experience with using dog sleds to deliver medical care. He became an Alaskan celebrity when he took a dog sled to the remote village of Iditarod to treat a patient. Beeson met up with Leonhard Seppala himself on his way back to Anchorage, and Seppala traveled with Beeson, at one point snowshoeing ahead of their teams so he could break trail when it started to snow. In Anchorage, Beeson carefully packs up the antitoxin, putting the glass vials in a lined case, wrapping the case in a quilt, and putting the quilt into a wooden crate. Finally, he wraps a cloth around the crate to deliver it to the Alaska Railroad to transport north to Nenana. As an afterthought, he puts a note on top of the cloth saying that the antitoxin should be brought in and warmed up every few hours. Governor Bone, meanwhile, is still toying with the idea of flying the antitoxin to Nome, but the weather in the interior, not known for its moderate winters, turns even colder. It's 45 and then 50 below in Fairbanks. Most of the interior is stuck in a deep freeze with temperatures colder than they've been in 20 years. On January 26th, Bone makes his final decision. It's just too cold and too risky for planes to fly to Nome. Even if the water-cooled engines could be kept going, the available planes all have open cockpits, and it would be difficult, probably impossible, for pilots to survive the trip. Bone sends word to Edward Wetzler, the postmaster in Nenana, to line up dog sled teams for a relay to take the antitoxin out to Nome. Bone promises that the Territory of Alaska will pick up the costs. He then sends word to Dr. Welch in Nome, telling him to send dog teams east to meet the relay. Bone decides to use a relay team instead of dogs from one team going halfway and dogs from the other team going the other half, in hopes that this will mean the antitoxin can keep moving day and night. When one team reaches the point where they need to rest, a new, fresh team can be on hand waiting to continue the journey. This should shave days off of the time required to get the antitoxin to Nome. Early in the morning of January 27th, Dr. Beeson brings his 20-pound package containing the antitoxin down to the train station, where it's put on the northbound train. Governor Bone's decision doesn't make everyone happy. The publisher of the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, William Wrongfont Thompson, had been pushing to take the antitoxin by plane, thinking that an aviation rescue would be a huge story that would show the state and its residents in the best possible light. Thompson lashes out in the way only men who buy ink by the barrel can do. On the evening of January 26, Thompson goes home and writes the first of a series of angry editorials criticizing Bone and everyone else involved in the dog sled relay. Thompson's editorial, published the next morning, January 27th, says in part, "Fairbanks is standing by, ready with airships and men to cut Nome's waiting time in half if Washington just wires the orders to go. Instead, Fairbanks, only 4 hours away by airship, must sit by the fire and envision the Nome babies and their pioneering parents strangling and dying most horrible deaths." He later wrote, "The friendly North has passed from the dog team stage into the airship class. In cases of great emergency, the dog should be allowed to sit by the fire and dream of old days over again, while gasoline and flying machines do the work that kills dogs." The route selected for the dogs to follow is roughly the same as the route taken by the Iditarod Trail sled dog race during its recent Fairbanks restarts, and covers much of the ground of the historic Iditarod Trail. Nenana is the last stop on the railroad before Fairbanks and is located on the old mail trail. From Nenana, the route follows the Tanana River to the mighty Yukon River. At Kaltag, the relay will follow the portage route over land to Unalakleet, and then up the coast across the frozen sea ice and into Nome. This trail is well traveled in winter, and a linked system of roadhouses had sprung up along the route for travelers. Wetzler sends out telegrams to mushers directing them to bring their dog teams and wait at their assigned roadhouses. On the evening of January 27th, Wild Bill Shannon waits inside the train station at Nenana. The hour grows later and the temperature continues to drop. Shannon, who is a mail driver, trapper, and fearless musher, is said to have the best dogs in the area. He's also known for having a short fuse and for taking bold risks with his dogs. These risks lead at times to big rewards and at other times to big disasters. The train finally pulls into the station just before 9 p.m. It's 50 degrees below zero. Given the weather, it may have made more sense to wait until the morning. Shannon looks across the river to the cemetery where 46 Athabaskan Indians who died 7 years earlier during the influenza pandemic are buried. Shannon tells Wetzler, "If people are dying, let's get started." Conductor Frank Knight hands over the 20-pound box, and Shannon ties it to his sled. He double-checks the lines, triple-checks his equipment, and then sets out into the night. Wild Bill's dog team is led by 5-year-old Blackie, but the remaining 8 dogs are yearlings with little experience. They've never before done a 12-hour run and have little experience with the type of bitter cold they're running into. The early part of the trail is rough going, filled with ruts from horse-drawn carriages. Fearing for the paw pads and ankles of his dogs, Shannon diverts the team onto the Tanana River. This is a risky move. Running on a frozen river puts the dogs and musher at risk if there's overflow or uneven ice from the shifting waters underneath. And while a good lead dog can generally navigate around overflow, even in the dark, they usually can't see uneven ice until they hit it, possibly losing their balance or damaging their paws. But Shannon is lucky this night, and the river is relatively smooth. It's the temperature that's the biggest problem. In the extreme cold, Shannon soon realizes he can't feel his hands and feet. He knows his brain isn't functioning well either, and decides he needs to take drastic measures to deal with the cold. Shannon starts shouting and waving his hands, doing whatever he can to stay warm. Eventually, he gets off the sled and runs next to Blackie in an attempt to keep warm. He stumbles into the Minto Roadhouse about 30 miles from Nenana at 3 a.m. on January 28th. The temperature outside is 62 degrees below zero. More with the wind chill, but at a certain point that stops mattering, and it's just really, really cold. Shannon is in bad shape. His face is badly frostbitten and his skin is turning black. 4 of his dogs have blood around their mouths. Shannon is too tired to eat and colder than he's ever been in his life. Following the directions of Dr. Beeson, Shannon brings the antitoxin inside to warm it. It's cold inside, barely 50 degrees in the roadhouse, but that's 112 degrees warmer than it is outside. Ironically, Shannon might have been able to hand the serum off at Minto to the next driver, Edgar Callens. Callens had arrived in Minto around 10:30 p.m. on the evening of January 27th, and he hoped to spend the night there, but was informed there was a diphtheria epidemic in Nome, and he needed to return to Tullavana and wait for the antitoxin. In Minto, Wild Bill Shannon realizes there is no other option. There is no one to take the antitoxin forward. He'll have to go the extra 22 miles to Tullavana, where Callens is waiting. Shannon huddles by the fire, drinking hot coffee and trying desperately to warm up. He starts to leave several times, but isn't ready and sits back down. Finally, around 7 in the morning, he repacks the antitoxin and goes outside to his dogs. It's still dark, but it's clear several of his dogs are in bad shape. He opts to leave the worst 3, Cub, Jack, and Jet, in the Minto Roadhouse because they can barely sit up. All 3 dogs will die within days. Shannon heads back out on the trail with 6 dogs in harness, headed for Tullavana. Just before 11 a.m. on January 28th at Tullavana, the sun is starting to rise. It's warmed up slightly and now is only 56 degrees below zero. There is a majestic stillness in the air, and Callens and the others wait for Shannon. From far away comes a sound. Faint at first, then getting louder. It's the telltale sound of dogs running and breathing together, and the soft swish of the sled's runners moving across the snow. Then Shannon and his team come into view. Moments later, Shannon arrives and stumbles as he sets the brake and steps off the sled. His face is cracked and black with frostbite. Blackie looks tired but alert. The remaining dogs look exhausted, and they are clearly in bad shape. Wild Bill hands the package of antitoxin to Callens, who brings it inside to warm it up briefly before continuing the journey. A few hours earlier in Nome, Leonhard Seppala gets the call he's been waiting for. Mark Summers tells Seppala to head out towards Nulato. They can have a relay for the first half of the journey, Summers thinks, but he knows that all he needs for the second half is Leonhard Seppala. Seppala already has his sled packed, his food organized, so he gets his best 20 dogs and puts them in harness. As Wild Bill heads out from Minto, Seppala heads south from Nome. It's 20 below zero in Nome, with winds that make it feel much colder. The streets are empty because the quarantine is in full effect. For the most part, Nome is hunkered down, waiting. After a little bit of a bumpy start, the Serum Run relay is almost in full swing. Next time, the press picks up the story. Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome noticed an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determined that the cause was diphtheria, a bacterial infection that causes gray lesions in the mouth and throat and eventually makes it impossible to breathe. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. The Board of Health unanimously votes for the dog sled relay. Now all they need is to locate the antitoxin. Word comes in from Anchorage that 300,000 units of antitoxin are at a hospital and can be sent to Nome. Early in the morning of January 27th, Dr. Beeson brings his 20-pound package containing the antitoxin down to the train station where it's put on the northbound train. It's 50 below zero. Given the weather, it may have made more sense to wait until the morning. But Wild Bill Shannon says, if people are dying, let's get started. After running to Minto and then on to Tolovana, Wild Bill hands the antitoxin off to Edgar Callens. Meanwhile in Nome, legendary musher Leonhard Seppala sets out with a team of 20 dogs determined to mush to the halfway point, turn around, and mush back to Nome with the antitoxin. This week, the press picks up the story. When you think about it, the Serum Run was the perfect newspaper story. Alaska had always been renowned as the last frontier, a place so remote and so deadly that it challenged the hardiest of men and women. And while the lower 48 were becoming more and more modern at the beginning of the 20th century, and there were fewer and fewer places in the lower 48 that were truly inaccessible, much of Alaska remained remote, hard to reach, deadly if you made a mistake. The automobile and then the airplane were making every bit of the lower 48 accessible. But Alaska was then and is now a place where much of the state is not connected by roads. Modern conveniences like reliable electricity and indoor plumbing were a luxury in many parts of the state. Add to the mix the heroic nature of beautiful and majestic dogs, and you get an ideal story for newspapers to run and to run with. Within days of the dogs starting to run, stories appear in newspapers on the West Coast and then all across the country. Headlines like "Dogs pitted against death in Nome race" battle with more matter-of-fact stories such as "Dogs carry antitoxin to snowbound Alaskan city." Writers and editors start contacting Dr. Welch and Governor Vaughan constantly, wanting interviews and details that nobody else has. Welch bristles at the idea of serving the media instead of his patients. But Governor Vaughan, who had once been a press agent, recognizes the enormous difference a few well-placed newspaper and radio stories can make. He finds himself spending more and more time with writers and editors, answering their questions and providing juicy quotes, including saying the mushers were suffering for the sufferers on the trail to Nome. Local officials, national officials, congressmen, senators, and even the president comment on the story, praising the brave residents of Nome and emphasizing that a great country stands by to help by whatever means necessary. The names of mushers and remote towns are thrown around. Newspapers diligently reprint maps filled with exotic names like Manly Hot Springs, Ruby, Nulato, and Unalakleet. Seemingly overnight, people all over the lower 48 fancy themselves experts on diphtheria, dog sleds, and the Arctic. As if to help make the story more relatable and dramatic, the deep freeze and severe weather that had battered Alaska makes its way south. The Hudson River freezes solid, locking New York City into the type of deep freeze more often seen in Fairbanks. Cattle on ships bound for places upstate freeze to death in their tracks in Manhattan. The dramatic reports of people on the East Coast dying in the cold just heightens awareness of the plight of those in Nome. Nome Mayor George Maynard begins sending anxious telegraph reports to newspaper writers and editors. To say he exaggerates the situation is putting it charitably. Maynard knows that papers want a dramatic story, so he gives it to them. He claims at one point that he might have to get a Russian icebreaker to deliver antitoxin to Nome, although he states that he would much rather have Americans help their own. At other times, he says that new cases are spiking and Dr. Welch is down to his very last dose of antitoxin. These claims are not strictly true. Maynard's urgent pleas for help, which ask for the U.S. to send planes to Alaska that could take antitoxin to Nome, unlike the open cockpit bush planes already in the state, makes news all over the U.S. Often, the stories are run at the top of the front page with a headline screaming in large type. The story in the Washington Post runs under the banner, "Epidemic grows graver. City begs officials to send aid by air." The New York Sun hypes a proposed rescue mission by air as the greatest humanitarian service ever rendered by a flyer in peacetime. In an era of hyperbole, this story is perfect. Fighting Dan Sutherland, Alaska's territorial representative in Congress, and Fairbanks Daily News minor publisher Wrongfont Thompson continue to lobby for an airborne solution to Nome's problem. But Governor Bone ignores the pressure from Sutherland and the press and sticks to his original idea of a dog sled relay. But Bone realizes that if the reports coming out of Nome are true, the epidemic is getting worse. He needs to find a way to speed up the relay even more. So the easy answer is more dog teams. While this requires some logistical adjustments, it makes sense to keep having fresh teams of dogs whenever the previous team gets tired to keep the antitoxin moving. Bone settles on a new plan involving 20 dog teams and over 150 dogs. But Bone and everyone else recognizes that Seppala is still the man everyone wants to carry the antitoxin across the tricky and dangerous Norton Sound. Going across the ice at Norton Sound is a significant shortcut that will save more than half a day. But the Norton Sound is also notoriously difficult, a place where blizzards come up out of nowhere, whiteout conditions are common, there is no cover from the fierce wind, and it's easy to lose track of exactly which direction a dog team is headed. The new plan is for Seppala to go as far as Shaktoolik, only about 170 miles from Nome. This means that Seppala will run 340 miles, not the 638 he'd originally planned for. But Seppala has already left, and there's no way to get in touch with him. Newly recruited drivers are told that in addition to transporting the serum, they need to keep an eye out for the Norwegian Seppala and his 20 Siberian Huskies. The first musher who spots Seppala will tell him to wait in Shaktoolik instead of going on to Nalata. In Nome, Gunnar Kaason, who works with Seppala and helps train some of Seppala's dogs, is told to head south to be part of the relay. Kaason goes to Seppala's dog yard, where he's been told he was free to use any of the remaining dogs for company business while Seppala is away. Seppala told Kaason that if Kaason ran a dog team, he needed to run Fox, a brown and black husky, in lead. But as Kaason looks up and down the dog yard, his eye is drawn to a black dog with one white front leg named Balto. Kaason selects his dogs and puts them in harness. At the last minute, he decides to ignore Seppala's wishes and places Balto in lead. Meanwhile, the antitoxin makes its way into the interior, and it's at this point in the middle of the story that things get interesting. Facts become fungible things, and it's hard sometimes to tell what's myth-making and what's real. Not to mention that poets, songwriters, and tellers of tall tales have already latched onto the Serum Run as a way to illustrate the stories they already want to tell, which doesn't make it any easier to separate fact from fantasy. In Tolavana, Wild Bill Shannon gives the antitoxin to Edgar Callens. Callens runs 31 miles to Manly Hot Springs in a little over 5 hours. It's 56 below zero when he arrives. By some accounts, Callens' trip is uneventful. But the owner of the lodge at Manly Hot Springs claims Callan's hands are frozen to his sled when he arrives, and he has to pour hot water over Callan's hands to get them off. So, you tell me, is it more mythic to go 31 miles when it's 56 below and have no problem, or to have your hands freeze to the sled so you need hot water to pry them off? That same day, Dan Green takes the package 28 miles to Fish Lake. It's handed off to Johnny Folger, who runs his team into the night 26 miles to Tanana. On January 29th, several new cases of diphtheria are discovered in Nome. 6 dog teams bring the antitoxin an additional 170 miles. Sam Joseph mushes 35 miles to Callan's. Titus Nikolai and his dogs go 24 miles to 9 Mile Cabin. Dave Corning and his dogs go 30 miles to Cochrane's. Harry Pitka brings the antitoxin another 30 miles to Ruby. Bill McCarty takes the antitoxin 28 miles to Whiskey Creek. And Edgar Nollner goes 24 miles to Galena, where the next driver is his brother George, who'd just gotten married a few days earlier. George takes the antitoxin 18 miles to Bishop Mountain. For the most part, everything is going well. Governor Bone's plan seems to be working, and the weather has even let up a little. But between Galena and Bishop Mountain, the weather turns colder again. George Nollner arrives at Bishop Mountain at 3 a.m. on January 30th and hands the antitoxin off to musher Charlie Evans. It's 61 degrees below zero. Things had been going smoothly. But remember, it's just when things start to seem smooth that you're in the biggest danger. Next time, ice fog as the trail turns deadly. You're listening to the 1925 Serum Run on Mushing Radio. Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome notices an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determines that the cause is diphtheria. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. The Board of Health unanimously votes for a dog sled relay to bring 300,000 units of antitoxin from Anchorage to Nome. A carefully wrapped 20-pound package of antitoxin is put on a northbound train where it meets the first dog sled team outside Fairbanks. It's 50 degrees below zero when the train reaches the first dog team of Wild Bill Shannon. It may have made more sense to wait until morning, but Shannon says, "If people are dying, let's get started." Meanwhile in Nome, legendary musher Leonhard Seppala sets out with a team of 20 dogs, determined to mush to the halfway point, turn around, and mush back to Nome with the antitoxin. As teams bring the antitoxin down the trail, newspapers all around the U.S. and then all over the world pick up the story. Senators and even the president comment on the relay using heroic terms to describe the valiant dogs and their human drivers. As if to amplify the needs of Alaskans, a deadly freeze settles into the lower 48, causing multiple deaths in the Northeast and freezing the Hudson River solid. Nome Mayor George Maynard sends out anxious missives to reporters, sometimes exaggerating conditions because he knows it will make a better story and attract more attention to Nome's urgent needs. More consideration is given to the idea of sending additional antitoxin by air, but Territorial Governor Bone realizes the dog sled relay is still the best way to transport the antitoxin. But to speed things up, he authorizes funds to increase the number of dog teams and drivers. Seppala now is only scheduled to go 170 miles to Shaktoolik and then back to Nome. This nearly cuts in half the mileage he'll run, but still allows him to make the treacherous Norton Sound crossing that everyone acknowledges he can do quickly and safely. But Seppala has already left Nome, and there's no good way to contact him. Gunnar Kaason, who worked with Seppala and his dogs, heads off to be part of the relay. Kaason ignored Seppala's instructions to use Fox as his leader, instead selecting a black dog with one white front leg named Balto. Along the route, other mushers are instructed to keep an eye out for Seppala and his team of 20 huskies so they can stop him and tell him the new plan. This week, ice fog as the trail turns deadly. Let's talk about ice. We're used to thinking of ice as smooth. We picture water freezing in an ice cube tray or the smooth surface of an indoor ice skating rink. But ice on rivers is different. And ice on a mighty river like the Yukon is far more complicated. Even those with years of experience are sometimes surprised by what they encounter. It's true that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius, but it's also true that it takes time for water to freeze at that temperature. And when you're dealing with a river like the Yukon, there is a lot of water. The Yukon flows for nearly 2,000 miles. It has an average flow of 1 million cubic feet every 3 seconds, and it discharges nearly 50 cubic miles of water a year into the Bering Sea. How much water is that goes out into the Bering Sea? It's enough to bury every inch of the island of Manhattan, 11,000 feet deep. It's a lot of water. If you've ever looked at a lake or a pond as it freezes, you'll notice that ice forms on the surface before it freezes lower down. So much of the time you'll have liquid water underneath the surface of ice, even when the temperatures are far below freezing. It's more complicated with rivers than with lakes. In a lake, the water is relatively still, but river water is moving. And as long as some of it isn't frozen, it continues to move. Temperature fluctuations can cause uneven layers of ice, and the flowing water underneath the ice often causes that ice to move. Additionally, pressure from above, from people, animals, or vehicles on top of the ice, can weaken the ice in places. And to further complicate things, the wind will blow snow and uneven ice around on the surface. This results in overflow, where ice breaks and some of the water that's underneath and hasn't frozen comes up onto the surface. And in extreme conditions, there might be holes in the ice or areas of ice that are weak enough for dogs, sleds, or humans to fall through. If you've ever been to the Iditarod restart in Willow, it's not unusual for there to be a few areas of overflow on Willow Lake, even when the temperatures are far below freezing and the ice is generally strong enough to hold the weight of 70 to 100 dog trucks, thousands of dogs, and several thousand onlookers. On January 30th, 1925, musher Charlie Evans gets the antitoxin from George Nolner at Bishop Mountain on the Yukon. It is 3 a.m. and more than 60 degrees below zero. Evans and Nolner head inside and warm the antitoxin by the fire for an hour before Evans leaves. Evans, who piloted riverboats along the Yukon and nearby Koyukuk River, is very familiar with this part of the trail and has spent most of his winters moving furs and supplies through the area by dog sled. He is well aware that the mighty Yukon's rushing waters move ice floes during the winter, especially around a sharp turn the Yukon takes at Bishop Mountain. Ice there is regularly pushed up against the riverbank, causing rocks and dirt to spill onto the surface and often be carried away from the shore as the ice continues to move. Evans sets out a little before 4:30 a.m. He's tired from waiting up for Nolner, but anxious to keep the relay going. 10 miles from Bishop Mountain, Evans encounters massive overflow. Where the Koyukuk meets the Yukon, the rushing waters underneath the ice cause the ice to crash together, creating cracks for water to come up onto the ice and uneven surfaces that could injure the dog's paws. Evans' dogs are well trained and familiar with the area and mostly are able to avoid the overflow. Evans knows the night is cold, but he doesn't know at the time that this will be the coldest temperatures the Serum Run faces, 64 degrees below zero. And then there's wind on top of that. The liquid water from the overflow will freeze in these conditions, but it freezes unevenly onto ice that is already uneven. More importantly, something stranger and more deadly happens when there's liquid water and it's that cold. Because heat rises, the heat from the relatively warm liquid water, just barely above freezing, moves upward, rising into the air. With more water coming up from behind it, that causes vapor from the water to rise up from the overflow. The frozen water droplets remain suspended in the air, creating dense areas that are impossible to see through. This is known as ice fog. Ice fog can literally seem like a curtain as breezes and the movement of people and dogs cause the suspended frozen water to move. Sometimes the fog parts, allowing brief periods where you can see what's in front of you. More often, you just have to ride out the ice fog, which can be dozens of feet thick and go on for miles. Early white settlers referred to ice fog as the White Death, believing the ice crystals would go into their lungs and cause them to die. But natives such as the Athabascan Charlie Evans knew it was a dangerous condition, but one you could live through, if you were lucky. Ice fog, like the northern lights, can be beautiful and inspiring. And when the world becomes shimmery and still, and ice literally hangs in the atmosphere, it's hard not to attribute it to the actions of some supernatural spirits. Certainly, it's a glimpse into a world most humans never see. For Charlie Evans, the ice fog comes up suddenly and seems to swallow his entire dog team, getting so bad that he can't even see the tip of his sled out in front of him. Many mushers faced with these conditions panic. Ensnared in the ice fog, you lose track of all reference points and quickly become completely disoriented. It gets impossible to tell which way you're facing, how fast you're going, and sometimes even which way is up. Without any landmarks, the mind wheels and panic can set in quickly. Even time seems to change and elongate in the thick mist you worry you will never emerge from. Evans, who has experienced ice fog before, knows he has to ride out the condition. He grabs tightly to his sled, plants himself solidly on the runners, and puts his trust in his dogs. Lead dogs without experience will often falter and refuse to keep going in ice fog, but Charlie Evans has leaders who have some experience with the condition and lots of experience with this part of the trail. He hangs on and lets them go. The wind picks up, blowing sand and dirt in from the banks of the Yukon. In the extreme cold, Evan feels the sand and dirt on him like he's being pelted by hundreds of shards of broken glass. Charlie Evans eventually emerges from the ice fog before getting to the village of Koyukuk. Evans' father, John Evans, who organized dog teams in this area, is waiting. He hears the soft squeak of the runners on snow in the distance and runs outside to greet his son. John Evans yells for Charlie to come inside and warm himself by the fire. "I can't," Charlie Evans yells. "The dogs might refuse to run again if we stop and rest." Charlie Evans and his dog speed by, leaving his father looking on. Evans' two leaders are mixed breeds borrowed to fill out his team. They have short hair and are not equipped for the extreme cold. They're more bird dogs than sled dogs. Normally, Evans would have protected their groin areas with rabbit furs, but he forgot in his rush to keep the relay going out from Bishop Mountain. Past Koyukuk, Evans' lead dogs develop severe chafing on their legs from their harnesses, which are rubbing their short fur and skin raw. Their legs, already frostbitten, start to turn blue, but they keep going. Finally, one of the dogs drops. Then the second goes down. Evans sets the hook and walks up to the front of his team. Both dogs are so severely injured they can barely move. They can't stand, let alone run. Evans carries them back to the sled and puts them both in the basket. Evans tries several dogs in lead, but his team won't run anymore. Finally, he releases the snow hook, goes to the front of the sled, straps a harness to his shoulder, and leads the dogs forward himself. By some reports, Evans is still the lead dog the rest of the way to Nulato. By other reports, his dogs eventually run without a human leader up front. In any event, around 10 a.m., Evans and his team pull into Nulato, the original proposed halfway meeting point for the Antitoxin. Evans parks by a cabin and carries the two injured lead dogs from his sled basket inside. He slumps by the stove. The dogs aren't moving. It takes a while to acknowledge the obvious. Both dogs are dead. They died in the cold, having given their lives to keep the serum moving. Evans and his team took nearly 6 hours to go a mere 30 miles. As was customary, the antitoxin is brought in and warmed by the fire in Nalato. But within 30 minutes, driver Tommy Patsy, with a fresh team of dogs, is ready to take the antitoxin onto Kaltag, where a trail leaves the Yukon River behind for a long trek out to the coast. Asked decades later about his role in the 1925 Serum Run, Charlie Evans looked into the distance and said, "It was really cold." Next time, Portage. This has been the 1925 Serum Run on Mushing Radio. Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome notices an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determines that the cause is diphtheria. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. The Board of Health unanimously votes for a dog sled relay to bring 300,000 units of antitoxin from Anchorage to Nome. A carefully wrapped 20-pound package of antitoxin is put on a northbound train where it meets the first dog sled team outside Fairbanks. It's 50 degrees below zero when the train reaches the first dog team of Wild Bill Shannon. It may have made more sense to wait until morning, but Shannon says, "If people are dying, let's get started." Nome Mayor George Maynard sends out anxious missives to reporters, sometimes exaggerating conditions because he knows it will make a better story and attract more attention to Nome's urgent plight. Meanwhile in Nome, legendary musher Leonhard Seppala sets out with a team of 20 dogs, determined to mush to the halfway point, turn around, and mush back to Nome with the antitoxin. More consideration is given to the idea of sending additional antitoxin by air, but Territorial Governor Vaughan realizes the dog sled relay is still the best way to transport the antitoxin. But to speed things up, he authorizes funds to increase the number of dog teams and drivers. Charlie Evans gets the antitoxin in Bishop Mountain and sets out with his team. They face the coldest temperatures of the entire trail, 64 degrees below zero. But even with those conditions, there is movement of ice and the overflow of water that comes up from cracks in the Yukon River. This leads to ice fog, which decreases visibility to near zero. Evans has to trust his dogs to keep going, and they do. But in a rush to keep the serum moving, Evans neglects to protect the legs and genitals of his 2 lead dogs, who are mixed breeds that don't have enough fur to protect them. The dogs get colder and colder. Afraid he won't be able to get them going again if he stops, Evans pushes forward. And then one of his dogs drops. A moment later, his second lead dog goes down. Evans puts the 2 dogs in his sled bag and keeps going, but he can't get his dog team moving again. So Evans throws a harness over his shoulder and acts as his own lead dog, getting the team to Nalato. He brings the 2 fallen dogs in to warm by the fire, but it's too late. They're both dead, having given their lives to keep the antitoxin heading to Nome. Asked decades later about his role in the 1925 Serum Run, Charlie Evans looked into the distance and said, "It was really cold." Tommy Patsy takes the antitoxin from Nalato to Kaltag, 36 miles. This week, Portage and the Spirits. In Kaltag, Tommy Patsy hands the antitoxin to a dog driver known as Jack Screw, whose real name may have been Jack Nikolai, or perhaps that's just his Americanized name. From Kaltag, the trail heads inland, leaving the mighty Yukon behind and heading through the mountains to the coastal town of Unalakleet. The Portage Trail has been used by natives for thousands of years. It was discovered and used by fur traders back when Alaska was a Russian territory, and continues to be used to this day by snow machiners and Iditarod mushers. Mushers will sometimes tell you that it's a completely different environment once you hit the coast. The long trip along the Yukon offers challenges, but they're different challenges from the ones found on the Bering Sea. The 80 miles or so between Kaltag and Unalakleet represent a kind of no man's land, where the slow shift between the Yukon River and the Bering Coast sometimes seems to warp reality itself. From Kaltag, the trail climbs up, gaining 800 feet of elevation. It's not a steep climb, but it's steady over the course of about 15 miles. And that 15 miles can get long. The trail winds through the woods to the top and then begins a long, slow descent into a gorgeous valley. For centuries, there have been stories about this area. Strange things reportedly happen here. Modern Iditarod mushers report frequent hallucinations in the area. They have conversations with people who aren't present and sometimes see things they later realize could not possibly exist. Surely some of this is due to the fact that modern mushers reached this part of the trail exhausted from days of little sleep and a need for downtime after many, many hours where they're required to be far more mentally alert than they're actually capable of. And yet, these stories occur so frequently that it's hard to dismiss them all. Jackscrew, an Athabascan, takes the serum from Kaltag. He and his team climb up in the evening of January 30th, 1925. From the summit, there's an amazing view of the valley and out towards the coast. Many mushers will stop there to snack their dogs, observe the natural beauty, and contemplate their place in a gorgeous, frozen world. Jackscrew does not pause. The darkness provides little to see that morning, and he's familiar with the area and its views. His focus is solidly on the trail and his dog team, and he's determined to take the antitoxin about halfway to Unalakleet, stopping at Old Woman Shelter and getting there safely, but as quickly as he can. There are many legends about the old woman. Some say she was killed in an avalanche, perhaps cursed for doing men's work, surveying up in the mountains. Others say she's a shape-shifting spirit who can appear as a bear or a wolf. And some say the spirit is benevolent and protective, but others insist she's spiteful. One man reported being awakened by her spirit during a particularly cold night, and had she not awakened him, he would have certainly frozen to death. Today, there is a Bureau of Land Management cabin open to all who pass by called Old Woman Cabin. It's located about a mile away from the original Old Woman's shelter. Custom has it that mushers must leave a small offering of food at the cabin for the old woman. Otherwise, she will chase them all the way to Nome, and bad luck will follow them for the rest of their trip. Longtime Iditarod musher Didi Janro reports hearing strange sounds around Old Woman Cabin, like humming or whistling. When she's asked if it's just the wind whistling through old wooden structures, she says no, it's a tune with notes that are soothing and seductive. Some Iditarod mushers report being lulled to sleep there and sleeping themselves right out of contention for the race. Many mushers report seeing and smelling fires when there's no one around. Didi Janro says she reminds herself in that portion of the trail not to stop, not to look, not to tempt the fates or the tricky spirits. Perhaps it was one of those spirits or the old woman herself who distracted Jake Berkowitz, who badly cut his hand on that portion of the trail, forcing his withdrawal from the 2012 Iditarod. But for others, the spirits are kind. Mushers have reported being awakened just before they fall off their sleds, or just before they encounter animals or other trail hazards. Many mushers, worried about appearing silly or superstitious, won't talk about these type of encounters publicly. But when they're at ease, on or off the trail, the stories flow. More than a few will tell you that they encountered the old woman herself on the trail, sometimes in the form of an animal, and sometimes appearing exactly as she was when she was young. After four-time Iditarod champion and modern mushing legend in her own right, Susan Butcher died, she had her ashes scattered along various places on the Iditarod Trail, including some at Old Woman Cabin. Her husband, Dave Monson, said Susan always loved Old Woman Cabin and added, "People get a spiritual feeling traveling through the area, a shiver like someone is watching you." Early in the morning of January 31st, 1925, Jack's crew arrives at Old Woman Shelter. There, Eskimo musher Victor Anagik is waiting. Ordinarily, there might have been tension. There were centuries of feuding and ill will between the Athabascans and other native groups. Bad feelings lingered, sometimes based on tangible issues like territory or fishing and trapping rights, and other times about real or imagined slights from both sides. It might have been a better idea to have a buffer between the two groups so that cooperation would not be required on the Serum Run. But that morning, the spirit of the old woman is kind. Both men are determined to do whatever they have to help the people in Nome. And for the time being anyway, disagreements are put aside. Victor Anagik warms the antitoxin briefly, then sets out for Unalakleet and the coast, where a whole new set of challenges await. Already the wind is picking up, and the most difficult part of the journey is almost at hand. Meanwhile, although no one quite knows exactly where he is, Leonhard Seppala and his large team of Huskies head south, still fully prepared to go all the way to Nalato and back to Nome. Mushers along the route have been told to keep an eye out for Seppala, but so far none have spotted him. As the wind picks up and a storm blows in, that is about to change. Next week, howling winds on the Bering Sea and the handoff. This has been the 1925 Serum Run on Mushing Radio. Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome notices an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determines that the cause is diphtheria. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. The Board of Health unanimously votes for a dog sled relay to bring 300,000 units of antitoxin from Anchorage to Nome. The original plan is to have Leonhard Seppala, a legendary musher and multiple winner of the All-Alaska Sweepstakes sled dog race, travel halfway, pick up the antitoxin, and return to Nome. In Anchorage, a carefully wrapped 20-pound package of antitoxin is put on a northbound train where it meets the first dog sled team outside Fairbanks. It's 50 degrees below zero when the train reaches the first dog team of Wild Bill Shannon. It may have made more sense to wait until morning, but Shannon says, if people are dying, let's get started. As the epidemic worsens, Alaska Territorial Governor Bone authorizes funds to increase the number of dog teams and dog drivers to get the antitoxin to Nome more quickly. Seppala, who is already on the trail, believes he's going all the way to Nalato with a team of 20 dogs. When the number of teams is increased, mushers are told to keep a careful eye out for Seppala and stop him in Shaktoolik. But Seppala is out of range of telephone and telegraph, so he has no idea that the plans have changed. As drivers take the antitoxin up the trail, they face temperatures going down to 64 degrees below zero, storms, and wind gusts of more than 100 miles per hour. The antitoxin moves down the mighty Yukon River and then across the Kaltag Portage before it arrives on the Bering coast at Unalakleet. This week, howling winds and the handoff. People often talk about the modern Iditarod Trail sled dog race as being divided into thirds. Each third of the race has its own unique features and challenges on top of the general overall challenge, of moving a team of dogs 1,000 miles through the Alaskan wilderness. The early part of the race, going over the Alaska Range and into the interior, and the middle part of the race, going along the Yukon River and out to the coast, present a series of technical difficulties that can sideline inexperienced mushers. By the time a dog team gets to the coast, they can sense that the end is near, even if it's still a long way off. Although the route from Unalakleet up to Nome doesn't feature the same elevation challenges, it brings with it a whole new set of problems. Wind and storms are a much bigger issue here than on earlier parts of the route. And so it was with the 1925 Serum Run. Norton Sound is 150 miles long and 125 miles wide at its widest point. It's known for constantly shifting ice whose sheets can break apart with little or no notice and float out to the Bering Sea. A collection of ice berms, open water, bumpy ice, smooth ice, pressure ridges, and the occasional huge floating chunk of ice, sometimes as big as a house, are all features of the frozen Norton Sound. It's not unusual for wind to be at hurricane speeds and cause wind chills of well over 100 degrees below zero. Add in snow and darkness, and it can become difficult to keep track of which way is north. Even mushers who can keep their sleds from being blown over report feeling disoriented when they're out on the ice. And sometimes they hear otherworldly sounds from the ice, wind, and the stark whiteness of the landscape. Reflections off the snow and the sky and other odd lighting phenomenon are common in the area. On Saturday, January 31st, 1925, Miles Gunningham gets the serum in Unalakleet from Victor Anagik at around 5 a.m. He brings the serum inside to warm it and goes out to look at the ice of Norton Sound. Gunningham is no stranger to the area, and he knows he has a choice of routes to get to Shaktoolik, where he's been told Seppala will be waiting. He can cut across the ice and save some distance, or stick to the shore where the ground cover is more certain. The wind has been blowing onshore for days. The onshore wind causes ice to stack up near the shore, which raises the level of Norton Sound, but weakens the strength of the ice. But last night the wind shifted, and now the ice is flowing back slowly towards the open sea. Additionally, there is an area of open water in that section of Norton Sound. This area, known as a polynya, is kept free of ice for most of the winter by the shifting winds that move in a circular pattern. Ice forms around the edges, but is then driven to the outside, which keeps the clear, open water in the center. This movement is accompanied by a constant grinding noise that's been likened to the sound of giant bulldozers dragging their metal parts across concrete. Gunningham is no stranger to the ways of ice and has an inherent intuitive sense of the ice in Norton Sound. He looks out onto the ice field and watches it rise and fall. It's in constant movement. He knows from the wind that a storm is coming in, and the ice will be breaking up. He turns away from the ice and goes inside to retrieve the antitoxin, having decided not to risk a journey over the ice. Instead, he'll stick to the longer but safer land route near the coast. It's 40 miles to Shaktoolik. The first 12 miles go up and down a series of hills, and there is some tree cover to provide protection from the wind. The worsening conditions make the trail less hospitable than it was a few days earlier, and far less than the highway-like conditions of the modern Iditarod, where trail breakers on snow machines are constantly improving the trail for the mushers and dogs. In 1925, it was not at all unusual for mushers to have to break trail themselves, especially when the weather worsened. So, as blowing snow makes the trail worse, Gunningham stops his team and puts on snowshoes. He walks in front of his team, crunching down the snow and laying in a trail. This requires walking back and forth several times to compact the snow. He then hops on the runners and lets the dogs run until the snow again becomes too deep for him, at which point he parks the sled and walks ahead, repeating the process. This slows down his progress considerably. Additionally, the wind has picked up again, making the wind chill dip down to 70 degrees below zero. But Gunningham, like the other dog drivers along the route, knows how important it is to keep the antitoxin moving towards Nome. So he, like many others on the trail, reaches deep down into his reserves of inner toughness and keeps going. After 5 hours, his team has only gone about 12 miles. He builds a fire in an abandoned hut and warms the antitoxin. He has 8 dogs with heavy coats. They're not fast, but they're tough and they're powerful. After warming himself and the antitoxin, Gunnar climbs up Blueberry Hills, which rise to a summit over 1,000 feet above sea level before they dip down in a steep descent that leads into Shaktoolik. This route contains several wind tunnel areas where the wind gusts can easily knock mushers and dogs off their feet. At the summit, the wind and snow are blowing so hard that it sometimes appears to Gunnar that the dogs are swimming through whitewater. As the dogs start their descent, the entire team is hit by whiteout. Visibility drops to nearly zero. Gravity and increased speed make Gunnar feel disoriented. Most mushers ride the brake on this section of trail, trying to slow down, and Gunnar is grateful that at least he's protected momentarily from the harsh winds. Mushers will often tell you that when the chips are down, it's the dogs who get you through. You train with your dogs in a variety of conditions, and you choose your leaders and wheel dogs wisely, knowing that there will be times when the musher means nothing and contributes little, and it's all up to the dogs. Coming down from the summit of Blueberry Hills, Gunnar knows he can't control much since he can't see a thing. But he knows his dogs, and he puts his trust in them. The dogs don't disappoint. They run true, and the whiteout eventually clears. Gunnar can see Shaktoolik in the distance, but he has to travel a few more miles with nothing to protect him from the wind. Hurricane-force gusts turn the trail into a sheet of ice, but Gunnar and his 8 dogs keep moving. Snow, ice, and sand carried by the wind pelt Gunnar and his dogs. He finally makes it to Shaktoolik around 3 p.m., having taken 10 hours to go 40 miles. At Shaktoolik, Seppala is nowhere to be found. No one knows exactly where he is, and there's some speculation that he might have gone across the ice and be waiting down in Unalakleet. Luckily, Mark Summers, who recruited many of the additional mushers for the relay, is prepared for this contingency. He's arranged for Russian Eskimo musher Henry Ivanov to wait at Shaktoolik with a fresh team of dogs. Ivanov brings the antitoxin inside and warms it for a bit. Back in Nome, Dr. Welch is worried that the epidemic may have spread outside of the city. A wire service reporter in Nome files a story picked up around the country that's headlined, "All Hope Rests on the Dogs." Welch learns that the antitoxin left Unalakleet, and he hopes that this means it will be in Nome the next day. While Gunnar decided against crossing the Norton Sound going north, Seppala had made the opposite decision heading south. He too knew that there was a storm coming in, but decided he could make better time crossing the ice with a tailwind heading towards Shaktoolik. Seppala later reports that he'd passed through several villages with government-run schools. He told the principals of the schools about the epidemic and urged the community to close the schools until the epidemic had passed, and to be wary of anyone passing through who'd been in or near Nome. Seppala's mighty 20-dog team, led by Togo, manage 130 miles in their first 3 days. The first day they only go 33 miles, but the team begins to work more efficiently and soon is firing on all cylinders. He makes it to Isaac's Point Lighthouse, across the bay from Shaktoolik. With Togo leading the way and the wind at his back, Seppala mushes toward Shaktoolik in the dark. Meanwhile, Ivanov is heading north across the ice towards Isaac's Point. Mushers in the area know that there are herds of wild reindeer near Shaktoolik, and those reindeer sometimes get into scrapes with dog teams. Other times the dogs will turn skittish around reindeer, not wanting to have any contact with them. As the wind chill drops past 85 degrees below zero, Ivanov's team spots a single reindeer who's separated from the herd. Ivanov's dogs get agitated and start fighting with each other, soon becoming tangled in their harnesses and gang lines. Ivanov plants his hook and goes forward to untangle his team and sort out the conflict. It's just then that Ivanov sees Seppala and his large team going past. Seppala waves and yells a greeting to Ivanov. Ivanov realizes it's Seppala and frantically calls out to him, "I have the serum. I have the serum. Turn around. Turn back. Seppala is convinced he must not have heard that correctly. The serum couldn't possibly be so far along the trail. He turns back and sees Ivanov frantically waving his arms and running. Seppala tries to stop and turn his dog team around, yelling at Togo to G, but teams of 20 dogs traveling 8 to 10 miles per hour cannot stop quickly. It takes about a mile for Seppala's team to stop and turn around. His dogs aren't thrilled at the idea of going back into a headwind, but Seppala knows he can count on Togo, and his lead dog moves forward, back towards Isaac's Point and Ivanov's dog team. When the two men meet, Ivanov explains what happened after Seppala left Nome, how the epidemic had gotten worse and the number of dog teams was increased so the serum could reach Nome sooner. Seppala takes the antitoxin and heads back across the ice, into a headwind, back to Isaac's Point. Even though it's not entirely clear to Alaskans that Seppala will even be caught and be part of the Serum Run, they have been giving breathless quotes to journalists about Seppala's legendary abilities as a musher and dogman. More than a few articles ignore other mushers altogether, focusing on Seppala as the only man who can save Nome. But out on the trail, it's hard going and slow. Seppala has his doubts about the ice, and at one point, Togo stops abruptly. Seppala spots open water dead ahead and realizes he and his team are on an ice floe. The team searches for a way off, but they're going out to sea. Seppala, with the precious antitoxin in his sled, searches for a way onto more solid ice. But he can't find one. And they float and float, with the wind against them and the ice floe slowly being blown out to sea. Seppala curls up with his dogs to keep warm, and he hopes a change will come in the wind direction that will save them and save Nome. Next week, Togo saves the day. Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome notices an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determines that the cause is diphtheria. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. The original plan is to have Leonhard Seppala, a legendary musher and multiple winner of the All-Alaska Sweepstakes sled dog race, travel halfway, pick up the antitoxin, and return to Nome. In Anchorage, a carefully wrapped 20-pound package of antitoxin is put on a northbound train where it meets the first dog sled team outside Fairbanks. It's 50 below zero when the train reaches the first dog team of Wild Bill Shannon. It may have made more sense to wait until morning, but he says, if people are dying, let's get started. As the epidemic worsens, Territorial Governor Vaughan authorizes funds to increase the number of dog teams and dog drivers to get the antitoxin to Nome more quickly. Seppala, who is already on the trail, believes he's going all the way to Nulato with a team of 20 dogs. When the number of dog teams is increased, mushers are told to keep an eye out for him and stop him in Shaktoolik. But Seppala is out of range of telephone and telegraph, so he has no idea the plans have changed. As drivers take the antitoxin up the trail, they face temperatures going down to 64 degrees below zero, storms, and wind gusts of more than 100 miles per hour. The antitoxin moves down the mighty Yukon River and then across the Kaltag Portage before it arrives on the Bering coast at Unalakleet. As unstable ice on the Norton Sound threatens to break up, a storm starts moving in. Leonhard Seppala heads across the ice towards Shaktoolik. Hours later, Henry Ivanov and his fresh team of dogs head north onto the ice from Shaktoolik. Ivanov spots Seppala as he's untangling his dogs after an encounter with a rogue reindeer. Seppala can't believe the antitoxin has already come so far. He takes the package and heads back north across the ice into a fierce headwind. Seppala realizes after several hours that he's on an ice floe that's heading slowly out to sea. When he can't find a way off, he hunkers down with his dogs, hoping the wind will change course and provide a way back onto firmer ground, or in this case, firmer ice. This week, Togo saves the day. Ask any experienced musher about great lead dogs, and you'll start hearing stories. Stories about the magical abilities of great leaders to know hazards before they appear, to find the trail when all seems lost forever, and to keep the team going against seemingly impossible odds. Pair a great musher with a great lead dog, and you can build a mushing dynasty, or at least string together a remarkable winning streak that lasts for several years. And so it was with Seppala and Togo. Togo knew things other dogs didn't know yet. More importantly, he knew Seppala. The two had run tens of thousands of miles together over many years, and Togo had grown to sense Seppala's moods and anticipate his needs. To put it mildly, Seppala's mood on the ice is not good, and the hours of waiting for a shift in the wind don't help. His mood is so sour that even dogs who don't know him as well as Togo pick up on it. The dogs begin to howl in the wind, and it's not a happy kind of howling. But Togo gets up, barks once, and quiets the others. They fall into line, going silent, waiting for something their leader can sense that they do not yet know. Seppala sits up, watches, and slowly begins to get a sense of what Togo already knows. The wind has shifted. It's now blowing towards the shore. The ice floe Seppala and his team are on stops drifting out towards the sea, and very slowly it drifts in towards shore. Hours pass, and Seppala finally can see the shoreline, filled with ice that had been blown to land and risen up at the water's edge. Seppala mushes up and down the edge of his ice floe, looking for some place close enough that he can jump onto the safer ice. But he can't find anywhere suitable. Seppala locates the closest point. It's about 5 or 6 feet away. This is too far to jump across. But, Seppala thinks, there's another way. If he can just get Togo to the other side, his lead dog can literally pull the ice floe to shore, or at least get it close enough for the team and the sled to make the jump. Togo is an amazing dog, and he's capable of great things, but he is not a superhero. He can't just jump 6 feet across open water to the stable ice. So Seppala decides he'll help. He attaches a long line to Togo's harness, lifts up his lead dog, and flings him over the water onto the stable ice pack. Perhaps this is where great lead dogs are made. Togo looks back at Seppala and the dog team, and he instantly knows what he has to do. He turns and digs in, advancing slowly to pull Seppala, the ice floe, the sled, the other dogs, and the antitoxin in towards him. Miraculously, this works, and Seppala knows he'll be on the stable ice shortly. But things in life are often not that easy, especially in Alaska and especially during Alaskan winters. The tow line that's attached to Togo, weakened by cold and wetness, breaks. Togo surges forward and the tow line drops into the open water. It looks again like all is lost. The wind might change at any moment and blow Seppala and his dogs back out to sea. More importantly, The antitoxin is still on the ice floe, and if it doesn't get onto stable ice and find its way to Nome, many, many people will die. But then Togo turns around. He looks back towards Seppala and sees the tow line disappearing into the water. And what happens next is the difference between a great lead dog and a legend. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was training, maybe it was some kind of divine intervention. But whatever the reason, as Seppala watches dumbfounded, Togo jumps into the open water, even though it's far below freezing and the wind and an incoming storm make it feel even colder. Togo locates the tow line and grabs it between his teeth. He jumps back onto the solid ice and rolls around until the tow line is tightly wrapped around his harness, and then he turns and digs in again and starts to pull. The ice floe begins to move, getting closer and closer. And when it's close enough for the dogs to jump, Seppala yells out a command, and his dogs jump from the unstable ice floe onto the stable ice, pulling the dog team, the sled, Seppala himself, and most importantly, the antitoxin onto the more sturdy ground, or in this case, the more sturdy ice. It's already dark, and Seppala and his team have traveled more than 50 miles already, but Seppala lets Togo lead them across the ice until they are back at Isaac's Point Lighthouse around 8 p.m. on January 31st. Seppala unhooks his dogs and feeds them. That day they've traveled nearly 85 miles, half the time going right into a strong headwind. Only when his dogs are fed and bedded down does Seppala go inside. He takes the antitoxin package with him and reads the instructions. He's worried that the serum is already frozen and might be ruined, or maybe the glass vials will break when he tries to warm them up. But he places the package near the fire, climbs into his sleeping bag, and hunkers down to get a few hours of rest before he continues on another 50 miles to Golovin, 50 miles that he and his team will be running directly into the wind. That night, the ice moves and cracks, becoming much less sturdy in the Norton Sound. Seppala is exhausted and falls asleep quickly. The wind increases and the storm begins to move in. The roadhouse owner shakes Seppala awake around 2 a.m. on Sunday, February 1st. Seppala knows it's time to leave. The trail is about another 125 miles to Nome, and the last thing anyone needs is to get stuck in a storm that will add additional hours or days to the time it takes the antitoxin to get to Nome. Seppala feeds his dogs. He puts them back in harness. He gives a few extra pets to Togo, thanking his leader for the amazing thing he'd done. Togo strains in harness, wanting to go forward. Seppala nods. He knows they still have a job to do. There will be plenty of time later to be sentimental and reflect on what they've done. With the temperature hovering around 40 below zero, Seppala rewraps the package of antitoxin, putting an extra layer of furs around it to keep it warm. He gets on the runners, as he has so many times before, pulls the hook, and sets off. Thanks to Togo, the Serum Run is able to continue, and the antitoxin makes its way further up the trail towards Nome, where the number of diphtheria cases has just risen to 28. Next week, Racing the Storm. Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome notices an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determines that the cause is diphtheria. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. The original plan is to have Leonhard Seppala, a legendary musher and multiple winner of the All-Alaska Sweepstakes sled dog race, travel halfway, pick up the antitoxin, and return to Nome. The Board of Health unanimously votes for a dog sled relay to bring 300,000 units of antitoxin from Anchorage to Nome. In Anchorage, a carefully wrapped 20-pound package of antitoxin is put on a northbound train where it meets the first dog sled team outside Fairbanks. It's 50 below zero when the train reaches the first dog team of Wild Bill Shannon. It may have made more sense to wait until morning, but Shannon says, "If people are dying, let's get started." As the epidemic worsens, Territorial Governor Vaughan authorizes funds to increase the number of dog teams and dog drivers to get the antitoxin to Nome more quickly. Seppala, who is already on the trail, believes he's going all the way to Nulata with a team of 20 dogs. He plans to drop some along the way and return to Nome with 8 dogs. When the number of teams is increased, mushers are told to keep an eye out for Seppala and stop him in Shaktoolik. But Seppala is out of range of telephone and telegraph, so he has no idea the plans have changed. As drivers take the antitoxin up the trail, they face temperatures going down to 64 degrees below zero, storms, and wind gusts of more than 100 miles per hour. The antitoxin moves down the mighty Yukon River and then across the Kaltag Portage before it arrives on the Bering Coast at Unalakleet. As unstable ice on the Norton Sound threatens to break up, a storm starts moving in. Leonhard Seppala heads across the ice towards Shaktoolik. Hours later, Henry Ivanov and his fresh team of dogs head north onto the ice from Shaktoolik. Ivanov spots Seppala as Ivanov is untangling his dogs after an encounter with a rogue reindeer. Seppala can't believe the antitoxin has already come so far. He takes the package and heads back north across the ice into a fierce headwind. Seppala realizes after several hours that he's on an ice floe that's headed slowly out to sea, and when he can't find a way off, he hunkers down with his dogs, hoping the wind will change and provide a way back onto firmer ground, or in this case, firmer ice. After a few hours, Seppala finds a point where the ice floe is close to solid ice, but it's still too far for Togo to jump, so Seppala picks up his lead dog and throws him onto the solid ice. Togo starts to tow Seppala's ice floe in, but his line snaps. Instinctively, Togo knows what he needs to do to be reunited with his human. He jumps into the water, retrieves the line, gets back up on solid ice, and slowly pulls the ice floe closer. Seppala is eventually able to jump across, and he and his team head back to Isaac's Point, where he's able to sleep for a few hours as the fierce storm settles in. This week, Racing the Storm. 2 a.m., February 1st, 1925. The owner of the roadhouse at Isaac's Point shakes Leonhard Seppala awake. It's time to leave if he wants a chance of beating the storm. The wind by now is howling, and ice on the Norton Sound is moving and cracking. Seppala has to go 30 miles to Golovin. As he gets ready to leave, an old Eskimo comes out and warns him that the trail is not good, and Seppala should stick closer to the shore. The normal trail, further out on the ice, avoids craggy areas that can be hard to navigate. But Seppala takes to heart the advice of the local and sticks to the shore, noting that parts of the ice have broken apart and are drifting out to sea. Even staying close to the shore, Seppala notices open water near him. It's 40 below zero, but the storm is causing the ice to move and break up. Togo leads Seppala and his team safely across the ice. Norton Sound pushes up in this area into a bay and lagoon on the way to Golovin. The village of Golovin is located on a spit of land that pushes out into the bay, creating the lagoon. The village and the entire area is named after Russian Vice Admiral Vasily Mikhailovich Golovnin, although the bay and lagoon are often referred to as Golovin Bay and Golovin Lagoon, the official names are Golovnin Bay and Golovnin Lagoon. But the village is officially Golov. The extra N was left off. The name of the village was misspelled early on in official documents, and the misspelled name sticks to this day. Seppala and his team make it safely across the ice, and he stops to brush snow off his dogs. While the dangers of the ice are behind them, Togo and the others face a series of steep ups and downs on the way up to the summit of Little McKinley. The dogs are running on fumes at this point. Their reserves are almost totally gone. They've traveled 260 miles in under 5 days and only had about 4 hours rest at Isaac's Point. But Seppala looks at Togo and gives the word, and Togo pulls forward. Some of the other dogs whimper and complain, but Togo's resolve pulls them back into line. An hour after Seppala comes up off the ice, the storm breaks up most of the ice left on the Norton Sound, and it drifts out to sea. Luckily, he made it past the area just in time. Seppala and his team of dogs climb up and down a series of ridges repeatedly before reaching the summit of Little McKinley about 1,200 feet above sea level. There's an amazing view of Golovin Bay from the top, but Seppala doesn't stop to look. His dogs race down the final stretch to Golovin, somehow knowing without being told that they'll get to rest there and they'll get food. When Seppala comes into town, it seems like the entire village is there to greet him and cheer him onto Dexter's Roadhouse, where Charlie Olsen is waiting with a fresh team of dogs. It's been 13 hours since Seppala woke up at Isaac's Point and headed into the storm. He hands off the antitoxin before taking care of his now exhausted dogs, who have traveled nearly 350 miles in just about 5 days. By the time the antitoxin gets to Nome, it will have traveled approximately 675 miles by dog sled. 91 of those miles were behind Seppala's amazing lead dog, Togo. And now, at Golovin, the antitoxin is just 78 miles from Nome. In Nome, the storm is bearing down and the winds are howling. Dr. Curtis Welch and Nurse Emily Morgan visit as many families as possible, and the locals try to enforce the curfew. Looking at the severity of the incoming storm, Welch worries that the antitoxin might not get there at all. One musher being delayed or lost could result in the glass ampules freezing and cracking, which would ruin the antitoxin. Welch calls an emergency meeting of the Nome Board of Health. He argues that keeping the antitoxin safe and having it arrive a day or two later is more important than risking having it not arrive. The board agrees and votes to stop the relay. Nome Mayor Maynard calls the roadhouse at Solomon and orders the relay stopped there. Word is also left at Port Safety, where musher Ed Roan is scheduled to be the final leg in the relay that will bring the antitoxin the last 22 miles into Nome. Because phone lines don't run to all of the villages, and the Signal Corps have not been able to get updates, no one in Nome knows exactly where the antitoxin is. They don't know if Seppala was ever found, and the last update they've had is that the antitoxin had just left Unalakleet on the way to Shaktoolik. They don't know that Seppala got the antitoxin, that he gave it to Olsen, and that Olsen is now on his way to give the antitoxin to Gunnar Kaason, who will bring it to Port Safety and Ed Roan. Roan, waiting at the roadhouse at Port Safety, feels halting the relay is the right decision. As the storm batters the area, he can barely see the ice beyond the small lagoon separating the spit of land and Fort Safety from the Bering Sea. The ice is in constant motion, and the wind is whipping around, blowing at more than 80 miles per hour. Roan reports to Maynard that the wind is blowing the snow so hard that it is impossible for man or beast to face the storm. As Roan is speaking, the line goes dead. Maynard, having done all he can, hopes the message will reach Kaason and no unnecessary risks will be taken. Welch, meanwhile, goes off to the Signal Corps offices in Nome to update officials in Washington before the storm comes in and disrupts communications. Welch's report to public health officials says violent blizzard now on is delaying progress. Have ordered Antitoxin stopped as I wish to take no chances on its freezing or being lost just to save a few hours. Meanwhile, Kaason is waiting in a roadhouse in Bluff. He never gets word that the relay has been paused. Instead, he waits by the fire for Olsen to arrive. Kaason doesn't know how fast the wind is blowing, but he knows he's never experienced any wind like this before. Still, he doesn't know when Olsen will arrive, so he needs to keep his dogs ready so that they can go at a moment's notice. This requires him to go out into the cold and feed his 13 dogs, including his leader Balto, periodically, and make sure they're protected from the wind and the blowing snow. Even though the dogs aren't going anywhere, the severe cold requires substantial calories just to keep them warm. Olsen and his team of 7 Malamutes, led by Jack, leave about 20 minutes after Seppala and the Antitoxin get to Golovin. The temperature is 30 below zero, and the wind is blowing at 40 miles per hour. As the storm whips against him, Olsen is repeatedly knocked off the trail by a storm that threatens to overturn his sled. At one point, he stops to put blankets on his dogs, who aren't doing well with the wind chill. But this requires Olsen take off his gloves, even if just for a moment. It's enough, however, and he suffers severe frostbite. After he gets the blankets on his dogs, he's able to keep going. But 2 dogs develop frostbite on their groins. In spite of the conditions, a dogged sense of perseverance takes over, and Olsen and Jack keep going, making the 25-mile trek to Bluff in just over 4 hours. By the time Olsen gets to Bluff around 7:30 p.m., Kaason has decided that Olsen is waiting out the storm somewhere and isn't coming. The wind chill is 70 below zero, and Olsen, when he gets there, is so severely frostbitten that he can't make his hands work well enough to bring the antitoxin inside. Kaason helps Olsen bring his dogs in. Kaason thinks the dogs probably couldn't have made it another mile, and he's amazed that they all survived the 25 miles as well as they did. Warming himself by the fire, Olsen's hands are white and basically non-functional. Olsen, a man used to blizzards and extreme cold and wind, tells Kaason about the storm and the extreme wind. It's so terrifying that the hair on Kaason's arm stands up. Even with an extra parka on, Olsen was unable to keep himself warm, and at one point he believed that he was going to die on the trail, and he just hoped that his dogs would keep going and get the antitoxin to Kaason. Outside, the snow swirls around, and Olsen urges Kaason to wait for the weather to clear. Kaason recognizes this as good advice, and he waits by the fire. Several hours go by, but the storm shows no sign of letting up. Kaason, who has first-hand knowledge of how bad things were in Nome, is anxious to get started. He worries the trail to port safety will become so covered in blown snow that it will be impossible to make it the 34 miles there. Around 10 o'clock that night, Kaason makes a decision. He's going for it. He doesn't have any idea that the relay has been ordered to wait. He just knows that the antitoxin has to get going. He puts on many layers, goes out and feeds his 13 dogs, and hooks them up to the sled. In Nome and Washington, officials are asleep, comfortable that they've done the right thing in stopping the dog sled relay. They have no idea that their orders will never reach the mushers. In Bluff, Kaason says goodbye to Olsen and heads out into the night. Seconds later, he's out of sight. Balto valiantly leads the team, but within a few miles the team is stuck in a deep snowdrift where blowing snow is stacked up against a ridge. Balto tries to run through. He makes it, but the other dogs behind him get stuck. Kaason stops the sled and makes his way to the front of the line. He gets the dogs unstuck, but the drift is too deep for the entire team to get through. Instead, Kaason has to turn his dog team around in the middle of the night, in the middle of a blizzard, and hope Balto can find a trail that will take them around the ridge. A team of 13 dogs and a sled is roughly the size of a large tractor-trailer truck. Turning that team around isn't something that can be done easily or quickly, especially when there's a narrow trail. But Kaason manages to turn the team around and get them going back the way they came. Balto sniffs at the ground, hunting for the scent of other dogs, a trail buried under several feet of new snow. He makes his way forward tentatively. Eventually, Balto gets the scent, he finds the trail, and he breaks into a run. Despite the storm, everything seems to be going well again. But the biggest threat to the Serum Run is just around the corner. Next week, Balto and Kaason make history. Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome notices an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determines that the cause is diphtheria. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I am in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. The Board of Health unanimously votes for a dog sled relay to bring 300,000 units of antitoxin from Anchorage to Nome. In Anchorage, a carefully wrapped 20-pound package of antitoxin is put on a northbound train where it meets the first dog sled team outside Fairbanks. It's 50 degrees below zero when the train reaches the first dog team of Wild Bill Shannon. It may have made more sense to wait until morning, but Shannon says, if people are dying, let's get started. Legendary musher Leonhard Seppala, who is already on the trail, believes he's going all the way to Nalata with a team of 20 dogs. When the number of teams is increased, mushers are told to keep an eye out for him and stop him in Shaktoolik. But Seppala is out of range of telephone and telegraph, so he has no idea the plans have changed. Back in Nome, Gunnar Kaason, who has worked with Seppala and helped train some of Seppala's dogs, is told to head south as part of the relay. Kaason goes to Seppala's dog yard, where Seppala has given strict instructions that he's free to use any of the remaining dogs for company business while Seppala is away. But, Seppala says, if Kaason runs a dog team, he needs to run Fox, a brown and black husky, in lead. But as Kaason looks up and down the dog yard, his eye is drawn to a black dog with one white front leg named Balto. At the last minute, Kaason decides to ignore Seppala's wishes and places Balto in lead. Dog drivers take the antitoxin up the trail, facing temperatures more than 60 degrees below zero, wind gusts of more than 100 miles per hour, and severe blizzards. The antitoxin makes it past the Yukon River, across the Kaltag Portage, and to the Bering Coast at Unalakleet, and then up to Shaktoolik. Past Shaktoolik, Leonhard Seppala is flagged down on the ice of the Norton Sound by dog driver Henry Ivanoff and given the antitoxin. He turns his team around and heads back north into a fierce headwind. Seppala realizes he's on an ice floe in the Norton Sound heading slowly out to sea. The wind changes and he's able to get close to more solid ice, but it's too far to jump, so he throws his lead dog Togo onto the ice, and Togo starts to pull a line to bring the ice floe closer. When the line falls into open water, Togo jumps in after it, grabs it, and tows Seppala, the other dogs, his sled, and the antitoxin back to solid ice so the Serum Run can continue. After running hundreds of miles with his dogs to get the antitoxin, Seppala's team follows Togo more than 90 miles up the trail, about twice as far as any other team on the Serum Run. On February 1st, 1925, Seppala reaches Galavant and passes the antitoxin to Charlie Olsen. Hours after Seppala leaves the Norton Sound, the storm breaks up the ice completely and floats it out to sea. Olsen and his team go 25 miles to Bluff, where Gunnar Kaason is waiting. The plan is for Kaason to take the antitoxin about 30 miles to safety, where Ed Roan is waiting. But with a blizzard raging, Welch recommends stopping the relay so as not to risk the antitoxin not getting to Nome at all. Nome Mayor Maynard sends out word to various roadhouses, including Safety and Solomon. Olsen and Kaason never learn about the ordered pause in the relay. Kaason heads into the storm and quickly encounters difficulty with huge snowdrifts, but Balto proves himself a good leader and finds the trail. This week, Gunnar Kaason and Balto make history. As the storm rages, Kaason's team quickly finds itself in whiteout conditions. The team runs on the frozen Topkok River, but Balto suddenly stops, and Kaason sees there is a stretch of open water overflow on the ice. He takes a different route and turns off the river and continues. Balto leads the team over a series of narrow ridges near Topkok Mountain, a 600-foot summit. With the wind gusting, it's easy for a team or a driver to lose balance and potentially tumble off the trail to his death. It's a challenge in daylight under the best of circumstances, and this was the dark of night in possibly the worst of circumstances. The dogs crawl forward slowly, one step at a time. Kaason later said, "Topkok is hell when it's storming," and it was storming plenty when he got there. With the dogs struggling for every foot they'd move forward, Kaason gets off the sled and helps push it up, trusting his dogs will keep him on the trail. At the summit, Kaason jumps back onto the runners as the dogs race down Mount Topkok. This is an area that is infamous to this day for its winds, and many mushers have been caught in wind tunnels that knock them off their sleds. The geography of the area, under the right conditions, creates a series of odd microclimates where it's perfectly calm one moment and then there are hurricane-force winds the next. Balto leads the team around a curve in the beach, and in the poor conditions, Kaason can barely see his wheel dogs. At one point, Kaason realizes he's passed the Solomon Roadhouse without seeing it. The plan was for him to stop there briefly before continuing to safety. Had Kaason stopped in Solomon, he would have received word that the Serum Run was supposed to pause and wait out the storm. But instead, he keeps going, figuring he's only about 10 miles from safety and can rest there once he turns over the antitoxin to Ed Roan. Shortly thereafter, Kaason hits a blowhole and an 80-mile-per-hour wind gust flips his sled and knocks him down. A second blast buries him in a snowdrift. Although Kaason is very tired, it's not clear he could have done anything to prevent the sled from tipping over, even if he'd been completely fresh. He rights his sled, sets the hook, and goes about the task of untangling his dog team. This takes longer than he wants, and he has to take off his gloves several times to get the dogs and gang lines in the right position. When they're finally ready to go, Kaason goes back to the runners and double-checks his sled bag for the antitoxin. It's not there. He gets off the sled and searches every inch of the bag. The antitoxin is gone. A frantic search of the area near the sled doesn't reveal the box containing the antitoxin either. Kaason cries out in frustration and drops to his knees. He looks over the area between where the sled overturned and where it stopped and methodically begins to search. But he can't locate the box. He starts crawling around in the snow, ignoring the cold, ignoring the frostbite on his cheeks. He even takes off his gloves, hoping his bare hands can give him hints based on the consistency of the snow. He's not sure what else to do. He has to find it. The bitter cold nips at Kaason's fingers, but he keeps searching. Eventually, his right hand smacks into the box. He frantically digs it up and puts it back on his sled, carefully tying it down with rope. He pulls the hook and is going. His hands are now badly frostbitten from searching around in the snow, but he doesn't care. Within a few minutes, the trail curves. Suddenly, the wind that had plagued Kaason since he left Bluff is at his back, propelling him and his team forward. The dogs keep running, enjoying the boost in their speed. Balto, in particular, is thrilled to be leading the way home towards Nome. As Kaason approaches safety, his team is running better than they had since they left Bluff. At safety, Ed Roan is asleep. Believing the relay has been paused and the message has gotten to Kaason somehow, he doesn't expect Kaason to arrive overnight, thinking Kaason will get to Solomon. He'll hold there until the weather clears. And even if Kaason does push on to safety, Roan figures, he won't arrive until at least 6 in the morning. But thanks to 10 miles assisted by tailwinds, Kaason is flying. He gets into safety around 3 a.m. on February 2nd, sets the hook, tends to his dogs, and takes the antitoxin inside to warm it up and see how Roan is doing. Roan is still fast asleep and doesn't wake up when Kaason arrives and comes inside. What Kaason does next remains controversial to this day. Although he is exhausted and his dogs are tired, Kaason decides to continue on to Nome himself. He later says it would have taken longer for Roan to get up and get his dogs ready, even though Roan's dogs were rested and fresh. Some have argued over the years that Kaason wanted the glory of being the one who brought the antitoxin into Nome himself, and Kaason would definitely cash in on this fact for decades after. After a short rest, Kaason decides to complete the relay himself. The trail from safety to Nome runs mostly along the beach, and by the time Kaason is back on his sled, the wind has died down. But Kaason and Balto are still facing a trail that has heavy snowdrifts, in part because of the blizzard that passed through. As many Iditarod mushers have learned, even though it might feel like you're basically in Nome when you reach safety, it's a mistake to take those last 22 miles for granted. Although the uneven trail slows down the team, Balto is able to lead them through, and Kaason is grateful he can at least see the trail ahead. Several hours later, Kaason recognizes the landmarks around Nome, and finally the cross of a local church. Around 5:30 a.m. on February 2nd, Kaason and Balto pull up in front of the Merchants and Miners Bank on Front Street in Nome. There is no one there to greet him. No one even knew he was coming. A few locals hear the noise and go outside to see what's happening. They see Kaason walking among his dog team, petting and praising them, and when he gets to Balto at the front, Kaason says, "Damn fine dog," before he collapses with exhaustion. Ed Rohn is still asleep in safety and has no idea the antitoxin arrived. There is famous footage of Kaason's dog team led by Balto mushing down Front Street before a small but enthusiastic crowd. You may have seen this and thought it was wonderful that the end of the Serum Run was captured on film. But as with much of this story, the truth is a bit stranger. There were camera crews in Nome waiting for the end of the Serum Run, but they were all asleep when Kaason and Balto arrived. 21st century reality shows aren't the only ones who believe it's okay to stage reenactments to portray some kind of greater truth. And the journalists of 1925 had no problem fudging the details to tell a good story. So later that afternoon, Kaason and his team come down Front Street once again, this time for the cameras. By now, Welch has the antitoxin, but for the millions who've been following the story, newsreel footage that will play in movie theaters helps them feel they've reached a satisfying ending. But that's not quite the end of this story. Next week, what happened next? Previously on the 1925 Serum Run. In January 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch of Nome notices an uptick of patients with severe coughs. After several deaths, he determines that the cause is diphtheria. An epidemic of diphtheria is almost inevitable here. Stop. I'm in urgent need of 1 million units of diphtheria antitoxin. Stop. The Board of Health unanimously votes for a dog sled relay to bring 300,000 units of antitoxin from Anchorage to Nome. In Anchorage, a carefully wrapped 20-pound package of antitoxin is put on a northbound train, where it meets the first dog sled team outside Fairbanks. It's 50 degrees below zero when the train reaches the dog team of Wild Bill Shannon. It may have made more sense to wait until morning, but Shannon says, "If people are dying, let's get started." Legendary musher Leonhard Seppala, who is already on the trail, believes he's going all the way to Nalato with a team of 20 dogs. When the number of teams is increased, mushers are told to keep an eye out for Seppala and stop him in Shaktoolik. But Seppala is out of range of telephone and telegraph, so he has no idea the plans have changed. Back in Nome, Gunnar Kaason, who has worked with Seppala and helped train some of Seppala's dogs, is told to head south as part of the relay. Kaason goes to Seppala's dog yard, where he's been told he was free to use any of the remaining dogs for company business while Seppala is away. Seppala told Kaason that if Kaason ran a dog team, he should use Fox, a brown and black husky, in lead. But as Kaason looks up and down the dog yard, his eye is drawn to a black dog with one white front leg named Balto. At the last minute, Kaason decides to ignore Seppala's wishes and places Balto in lead. Drivers take the antitoxin up the trail, facing temperatures more than 60 degrees below zero, wind gusts of more than 100 miles per hour, and severe blizzards. The antitoxin makes its way past the Yukon River, across the Kaltag Portage, and to the Bering Coast at Unalakleet, and then up to Shaktoolik. Past Shaktoolik, Leonhard Seppala is flagged down on the ice of the Norton Sound by Henry Ivanov and given the antitoxin. He turns his team around and heads back north into a fierce headwind. Going across the shifting ice of the Norton Sound, Seppala's team, led by Togo, gets stuck on an ice floe heading slowly out to sea. Seppala waits until he gets close to more solid ice. He throws Togo across to the solid ice, and Togo pulls Seppala and his team to safety, even jumping into open water when his tow line drops in. Seppala passes the antitoxin to Charlie Olsen, who passes it to Gunnar Kaason. Kaason is supposed to take the antitoxin about 30 miles to safety, where Ed Rohn waits with a fresh dog team. But Welch in Nome recommends pausing the relay as a blizzard hits the coast. Word is sent to the roadhouses, but Kaason misses the roadhouses and keeps going. The wind flips Kaason's sled and sends the package of antitoxin into deep snow. Kaason searches with his bare hands until he finds it. When he reaches safety, Rohn is fast asleep, so Kaason decides to push on the last 25 miles or so to Nome. He arrives around 5:30 a.m. on February 2nd, 1925. Kaason and his dog team pull into the empty streets of Nome. It's less than 6 days after the relay started. This week, the end of the epidemic. Triumph of man and dog. Mission of mercy a success. Dogs run through storm. Remote seacoast village saved by hero dogs. Those were just some of the headlines in newspapers around the United States after Gunnar Kaason delivered the 300,000 units of antitoxin. An editorial in the New York Sun said, "Science made the antitoxin, but science and modern machines could not get it to know. That oldest of all motors, the heart, whose fuel is blood and whose spark is courage," wrote the Sun, "never stalls." President Coolidge issued letters of commendation. Various lawmakers also honored the dog teams and their drivers. Pharmaceutical firm H.K. Mulford struck 20 gold medals, one for each relay driver. Governor Vaughan of Alaska kicked in a $25 bonus and a citation for each driver as well. Money was raised by various groups for the dog drivers and generally divided equally among them. But before that, Kaason's arrival was reenacted so it could be filmed, and the film, along with the first photos of Balto and Kaason arriving in Nome, again from the reenactment, were put in a solid film canister. The film canister went by a dog team led by John Hegnes south to the ice-free ports. It traveled there by steamship south, and then Hegnes threw it overboard in a sealed container, which was retrieved by the crew of a small boat and transferred to a seaplane where it could be flown to Seattle, where the photos were published in an evening edition of the Seattle Times in early February. Backing up just a little bit further, shortly after 5:30 a.m. on February 2nd, 1925, Dr. Curtis Welch was awakened by a persistent knocking on his door. When he opened the door, there was Gunnar Kaason, who handed him the fur and canvas-wrapped package, 20 pounds of antitoxin, now mostly frozen. But fortunately, the glass vials protected and not shattered. Outside, Kaason's dog team was clearly exhausted. Curtis Welch and nurse Emily Morgan went to work immediately. Bringing the antitoxin to the worst cases, they were able to see nearly immediate improvements. The 300,000 units of antitoxin did not last long because when Kaason arrived, there were 70 confirmed cases of diphtheria in Nome and the surrounding areas. Many additional people had also been exposed to the disease. The official death toll was 5, but the real toll was likely much higher. It was Eskimo tradition at the time for families to just bury their children, and locals believed many children had died and were buried without the parents bothering to make any official report. With so many cases of diphtheria, the initial shipment of antitoxin did not last long. Fortunately, an additional shipment of 1.1 million units of antitoxin had been brought to Seward, Alaska. It arrived on February 7, 1925, and then a second dog sled relay, using many of the same mushers from the first relay, again brought the antitoxin across Alaska to Nome. Most details about that second Serum Run have been lost to history. Ed Rohn, the man sleeping at port safety when Gunnar Kaason decided not to wake him up and take the antitoxin the last few miles by himself, brought the 1.1 million units into Nome on February 15, 1925. On February 21st, the quarantine was officially lifted. The serum delivered by Kaason made it from Nenana to Nome, nearly 675 miles in about 5.5 days. The trails were well established and familiar to the mushers who delivered mail on them, but the trip at that time was normally 25 days. Arguably, there was less urgency in bringing the second batch of antitoxin to Nome, but the journey was no less heroic, even if it took nearly 8 days instead of less than 6. But while the initial story had the world waiting anxiously for every detail and was covered at great length and with an eye towards myth-making, the journey of the second batch was mostly ignored. Maybe that's just human nature. It's harder to get excited about the second time something amazing and miraculous happens. Just ask the crew of Apollo 12, who still accomplished something seemingly impossible by landing on the moon. Except they did it after Neil Armstrong, and for that reason, not many people even remember who they were. When Wild Bill Shannon returned to Nenana, he had 5 dogs pulling his sled and 4 riding in the sled back. 3 of those 4 died a few days later. Shannon told a reporter that he deserved no credit for his role in the Serum Run. The real heroes of that run, he said, were the dogs who did the work, the dogs who gave their lives on an errand of mercy. Those were not the only dog deaths. As we discussed earlier, 2 of Charlie Olsen's dogs died from frozen groins. Even Leonhard Seppala's dogs were not exempt from problems. On their way back to Nome, Seppala's team passed a nearby reindeer. Togo and another dog bolted and tore free from their harnesses to chase the reindeer, and this echoed Henry Ivanov's dogs chasing the reindeer and getting tangled up right outside of Shaktoolik, which is where they found Seppala. Togo trotted home to Nome a few days later. Sled dogs have a great sense of smell and direction, and often will return home from many miles away, sometimes from several hundred miles away. Seppala would complain in later years that Togo was not given enough credit for what he did in the Serum Run. Too many people, especially those outside of Alaska, tend to focus all their praise and appreciation on Balto, often ignoring Togo and the other dogs altogether. The 1995 animated movie Balto didn't help matters, since it implied that Balto had gone the entire length of the Serum Run, taking the serum to Nome on his own. Some argue that Kaason knew this would happen and deliberately went on to Nome himself so that he could reap the benefits of fame. That statue in New York City's Central Park is Balto, not Togo. There's a tendency sometimes for those outside Alaska to see some of the things Alaskans do as overly heroic, overly mythical. Even though the modern Iditarod Trail is carefully groomed and broken ahead of the dog teams that rush to Nome in record time these days, going that far with a dog team is still miraculous and is still larger than life. Officially, the modern Iditarod does not specifically celebrate the 1925 Serum Run, but instead celebrates the general role of sled dogs in Alaska and Alaskan history. That's all well and good. But the 1925 Serum Run is such an important part of sled dog history and Alaskan history that it seems silly to ignore this. People often ask me why it is that I love sled racing and the Iditarod and the Yukon Quest. And there are 2 very simple reasons. The first is the dogs. If you've never had a chance to be behind a dog team, the exhilaration and sheer joy when they start to run is one of the purest and most amazing things on earth. And the second is, even when the world seems to be getting smaller and smaller day by day, long-distance sled dog races like the Iditarod and the Yukon Quest are still so big that they, even now, even today, seem larger than life, even though we live in a world of drones and satellite imagery and GPS devices. And that's just how it is today. Imagine how it was nearly 100 years ago, when there were no satellites, when much of Alaska had not been accurately mapped, when weather prediction was intuitive and often unreliable, and there was no way to keep track of exactly where a dog team was for most of the time when they were out on the trail. And as we're taping this, today is the 93rd anniversary of when Gunnar Kaason and Balto first brought the antitoxin into Nome. The achievements of the men and dogs involved in the 1925 Serum Run remain remarkable and heroic. And even if Alaskans shrug off extraordinary achievements, these achievements of these men and these dogs are still larger than life, nearly 100 years later. Here at Mushing Radio, even though we talk a lot about mushers and the human stories behind dog sled racing, we try never to forget that literally none of this would be possible without the dogs. And we would like nothing better than to give you a complete list of the approximately 150 dogs who ran the 1925 Serum Run. Sadly, such a comprehensive list is not available. Just for the record, here is what we do know. Here is the list of mushers who ran the 1925 Serum Run. Wild Bill Shannon, 52 miles from Nenana to Talavana. 3 of his dogs, Cub, Jack, and Jet, were injured from the cold and later died. Dan Green, 31 miles from Tolavana to Manly Hot Springs. Johnny Folger, 28 miles from Manly Hot Springs to Fish Lake. Sam Joseph, 26 miles from Fish Lake to Tanana. Titus Nikolai, 34 miles from Tanana to Callens. Dan Corning, 24 miles from Callens to 9 Mile Cabin. Edgar Calland, 30 miles from 9 Mile Cabin to Cochreens. Harry Pitka, 30 miles from Cochreens to Ruby. Bill McCarty, 28 miles from Ruby to Whiskey Creek, led by his dog Prince. Edgar Nollner, 24 miles from Whiskey Creek to Galena, led by his 8-year-old leader, Dixie. George Nollner, 18 miles from Galena to Bishop Mountain. Charlie Evans, 30 miles from Bishop Mountain to Nulato. Tommy Patsy Patson, 36 miles from Nulato to Caltag. Jack Nikolai, Jack Screw, 40 miles from Caltag to Old Woman Shelter. Victor Anagik, 34 miles from Old Woman Shelter to Unalakleet. Miles Ganag Nan, 40 miles from Unalakleet to Shaktoolik. Henry Ivanoff, about a mile from Shaktoolik to just outside Shaktoolik, where he spotted Seppala on the ice. Leonhard Seppala, 91 miles from Shaktoolik to Golovin, with his leaders Togo and Scotty. Charlie Olsen, 25 miles from Golovin to Bluff, behind his lead dog Jack. Gunnar Kaason, 53 miles from Bluff to Nome, behind his lead dog Balto. For most of these men, the glory and recognition they got was fleeting. Many of them, especially the natives, were uncomfortable with the limelight, didn't seek it out. Most of them, even decades later, would point to their participation in the Serum Run as one of the highlights of their lives. Next week, the aftermath.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Matsu Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site, and you can hear all of our episodes over on DogWorksRadio.com. You can also find us on social media just by searching DogWorks Radio, and joining me today is my co-host. His name is Alex Stein, and he's calling in from California. And today we're going to tell you guys the rest of the story of the 1925 Serum Run. If you have not had a chance to listen to our 10-part series, pause right here, go back to our feed, and you will find all episodes listed in order from beginning to end, and it was hosted by our friend Alex. But first, we're going to talk to Alex about some of the behind-the-scenes and nuts and bolts parts that it took to make our first season here on Mushing Radio, talking about the 1925 Serum Run. All right, Alex, I know you just finished up with our first full season here on Mushing Radio, and we told the story of the 1925 Serum Run. And you know me, I love to hear some of that nuts and bolts, behind-the-scenes stuff of what it took to make something like this. I know this was not only a passionate project for yours and a story that you wanted to tell for a long time. You and I have talked about this for the last couple of years, and we finally put pen to the paper, so to speak, and got it recorded and out on the air. So I want to hear from you. What did it take to make a story like this? Where did you get your sources from? Just tell us about sort of the making of the Serum Run.
Yeah, so there were a whole bunch of sources that I used, um, books and articles and newspaper accounts and things like that. The most useful one, I would say, is there's a book that came out a few years back called The Cruelest Miles, by Gay Salisbury and Lainey Salisbury, which really has a lot of detail about the Serum Run. And they did a fantastic job of pulling in a lot of information from various different sources. Also, there's a lot of information available on some of the Alaskan newspaper sites, on the Iditarod site itself. Our friend Helen Hegener has some really amazing material that she's put up, and that's in some of her books. So it was a lot of pulling from a bunch of different sources to get this, and it was pretty much organized along the lines of how the Serum Run progressed. So it started out with setting up the outbreak and the epidemic and what was going on in Nome, and then going through the process of putting the relay together, which originally was just going to be two mushers, each going halfway, and Leonhard Seppala was going to go halfway from Nome to Nulato and then turn around and come back to Nome. And then it was expanded, and there were a lot of different things that, as it was going on, were pulling it in one direction or another. There's a lot of stuff about the press coverage, as you mentioned, and there's even some archival interviews with some of the mushers that was done many decades later, like in the 50s and 60s. And some of that stuff is available online as well.
So let's dive a little bit deeper, Alex. For our longtime listeners, they should know that you are a professional storyteller. This is what you do to make a living, and you do live in LA, and you're sort of in that scene. Can we talk a little bit about the making of the story itself, and can you let our listeners know what makes a good story like this? How does it flow well? How did you compose it? Even how did you record it to equal what the end product was? How long did it take you? That sort of stuff.
Each episode probably took about 10 to 12 hours to put together, all in. For me, what makes a good story is something that really connects emotionally. And we have a little bit of a head start in this because the people listening to this are people who care about mushing, who care about dogs. We can take a little bit of we don't have to explain as much about dogs as we might if we were dealing with people who didn't have any connection to dog sledding. But for me, what really makes a good story is something that connects emotionally with you. So what I've found is, in a lot of cases, that means, none of the people listening were around in 1925, and they certainly weren't the people who were on the back of these dog sleds. But if you can get as much detail as possible, then I think that helps put people right in the middle of the story. The most effective stories, and you can look at this in your favorite novels or your favorite movies as well, is those stories where you really feel like you're part of it. And people have done brain studies and done MRIs on people who are listening to stories or who are telling stories. And there's a strange thing that happens where the response of your brain as you're listening to a really compelling story is almost exactly the same as if you were living through that story. So when we talk about really putting yourself in the middle of the story, that's essentially what we mean. And that's always what I am trying to do. In this case, there was also some stuff that helped. I got some sound effects that I used, hopefully not overused, but it's one thing to talk about the wind or to talk about the wind in detail, But if you're talking about the wind and you're talking about how cold it is, and then you hear the sound of the wind blowing, that just will give you a little bit of an extra chill. So try to add a lot of that, and really just follow the story where it went. I recognize that I have a tendency to romanticize this stuff, so I was on my best behavior and trying not to do that.
That sort of leads into my last question when you talked about the sound effects and all that. As most folks know, we are, of course, not professional podcasters, so to speak. We do not, we aren't employed by NPR or anything like that. And we kind of went into this with a little bit of amateurism, I guess, meaning that we weren't going to have a highly produced show with, drop dead audio and that sort of thing. We just sort of went with it as it was. So how did you think about it doing as a podcast? A podcast is a relatively new medium, even though there's 250,000 or so podcasts out there about every topic imaginable. This is our first season of sort of kind of a long form audio in terms of a series. How did you take the podcast portion of that, and how is that different from what you normally do? My understanding is typically you go to like open mic type events where you read stories aloud to audiences and that sort of thing, compared to even how you would write a story for a book or a magazine or whatever. Can you compare and contrast what you do typically and then how you're doing it on a podcast?
It's very, very similar. The difference is that the stories that I tell live, which I tell stories at venues all around Los Angeles, those stories are things that have happened to me or my personal essays. This is much more, much more fact-based. It's much more historical. So that's a little bit different. But in terms of how I wanted the story to come across and how I wanted to tell the story, aside from the fact that it's not me behind the sled, I wanted to do everything that I could to put the listener behind the sled. And that's really the same approach that I have in telling any kind of story. I want to make sure that people know where they are, that they don't get lost, that there's kind of a natural flow to it, that it builds up in intensity. Honestly, when I started doing this, I wasn't exactly sure how long each of the episodes were going to be, and we had a discussion about how many episodes there were going to be, and I don't think that I had a clear answer when we were going into it for that either. But it just really took on a very nice life of its own. And then, in recording it, I would write it out, and I would record it, and I would, go through and edit it and take out the number of times that I said, because that bothers me. And I thought, as long as I'm editing it, I may as well take those out. And really then added in a little bit of sound effects and some music. And, so it's sort of, it's very similar to what I do live on stage, except maybe a little bit more produced.
Well, people really enjoyed the series. I know we had several people that were the first ones to download it, and they were the first ones to comment over on social media, whether it be Facebook or Twitter or whatever. I think people really enjoyed our first season, and I'm looking forward to doing season 2 with you in the near future. I know we're getting ready to do some semblance of coverage for Iditarod. I had no idea that you were taking 10 or 12 hours per episode, so I have to applaud your work effort. Man, that's a labor of love for sure. So thanks a lot for sharing that sort of backstory with us. I really enjoyed it.
And, I want to mention also that we both, and we've talked about this off air a lot, we both absolutely adore our listeners and our fans, and we love hearing from you guys. And we try to interact as much as we can on social media. But I want to encourage, again, as we do every week, people to get in touch with us if you have comments, if you have thoughts, if you have things that you would like to hear, or things that you would not like to hear, or if you want to point out that I got some name wrong or mispronounced the name of an Alaskan town, which I'm sure I did more than once.
So I know it may be a little early in the game since we just ended the first season last week. Any thoughts on the upcoming season 2 sometime in 2018?
No.
We'll keep the people in suspense. We have some ideas of what we're thinking about, but we'll let this lie for a little bit before we decide to go into something else. And I know you and I've talked, and maybe I will do season 2, but I definitely will need some help in all of that behind the scenes writing and all that part of it, because that's what you do as a master, Alex.
Yeah, and I have to say also that I know I've said this before, but I'm very thankful to you for bringing me onto this podcast and program as co-host, and it's just been an amazing experience for me, and I'm so happy about all of the stuff that I've gotten to learn and all of the people that I've gotten to meet as a result of Mushing Radio.
Excellent. Well, Alex, thank you very much for your storytelling and your expertise. And with that, guys, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the players in the story with Balto and Togo and Leonhard Seppala and Gunnar Kaason and all that.
Okay, so let's jump right in then, I guess.
Yes, as we mentioned, we're going to tell the rest of the story of the 1925 Serum Run, and you have some info about some really famous dogs, and we're going to start out with Balto. Is that right?
Right. So Balto is, because Balto was Gunnar Kaason's lead dog when he finished the Serum Run, there is, for a lot of people who don't know a lot about the Serum Run, there is the assumption that Balto was the most important dog, or in some cases, if you look at the 1995 animated movie, that maybe Balto was the only lead dog who ran the entire Serum Run. And that's not true, and that's also been the subject of some hurt feelings and some controversy over the years. But because Balto was the dog who finished and who brought the serum, the first serum into Nome, he's the most famous dog. He's the dog who was in the pictures. He's the dog who was in that film clip that was actually reenacted the next day or that afternoon. And there was always a feeling that perhaps Kaason had deliberately avoided handing the serum off so that he could be the one who got all of the glory. And in fact, after the Serum Run was over, Kaason became a minor celebrity. He was given a role in a movie. He brought Balto and some of the other dogs down to tour the United States, the lower 48. They did a bunch of local appearances, and there was a statue of Balto that was erected in Central Park in New York City at the end of 1925. Gunnar Kaason and Balto were in a movie, a 30-minute movie that I believe was called Balto and the Great Race of Mercy, that was released later in that year. And they pretty much were touring all around the lower 48. But because nothing in this story is exactly as simple as maybe we would want it to be, there were a lot of promoters that Kaason was dealing with who were a little bit on the sleazy side. And so his dog ended up being not particularly well treated. And at one point, Balto and many of the dogs were in, I believe, Los Angeles, and they were underfed, and a businessman from Cleveland was given the opportunity to purchase Balto and these other dogs, and he was given 2 weeks to raise the money to bring Balto and the other dogs to Cleveland, which he subsequently did. He had a fundraising effort and raised $2,000, brought them to Cleveland, where he exhibited them in a zoo. And Balto ultimately, when he died a few years later, is now in a museum in Cleveland.
Right. It sounds pretty suspect to me on how things sort of ended up. But it's sort of the nature of the beast. Anytime that celebrity takes over, all sorts of things go out the window. And you living sort of there in the City of Angels and Hollywood and all of that, you probably know a lot about how that sort of thing works its way out. You can have such a minor role in some type of event, whether it's historical or not, and the next thing you know, the tabloids take over and you are semi-famous. I'm sure you see that all the time.
Oh, yeah. And, Leonhard Seppala, this was particularly grating to Leonhard Seppala, who was not the sort of guy who went out of his way to seek fame or acclaim. And here Gunnar Kaason is with, don't forget, a dog that belonged to Seppala and that Seppala had trained. And Kaason originally was working with Seppala for his dogs. And suddenly Seppala is kind of cut out of the picture in the popular, way of looking at how the Serum Run went down. And Togo, who was a completely amazing dog, also was kind of cut out. And I think Seppala spent a long time really trying to get Togo to be recognized as every bit as important as Balto, even though he didn't finish the race. Seppala also took a team of dogs after seeing how well Kaason had done in 1925. The following year, Seppala took a team of dogs, including Togo, on a tour that started in Seattle and Washington State and went all the way down to California. They would appear in department stores and even did a series of advertisements for Lucky Strike cigarettes. And then he took the team to New York City, drove them down the steps of City Hall and through Central Park, where ironically there was the statue of Balto then. And they made several appearances at Madison Square Garden, which at the time was managed by Tom Rickert, who had lived in Nome. And at one of these events, Togo was awarded a gold medal by Roald Amundsen, who was a Norwegian explorer who was the first man to the South Pole.
Interesting. What I find really cool about this story, if you guys remember when you were listening to our episodes, I believe it was the second episode where Alex titled the show "The Press Picks Up the Story," and I think. And I think we talked about this on the show, and we've talked about it several times here on the podcast, is this was really one of the first major stories that sort of picked up with the Telegraph and all of that, really started that almost social media type revelation. And this is how these dogs became famous, because otherwise nobody would know who Balto was and Togo and Seppala and Kaason and all of these people when it's sort of in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. If it wasn't for this tenacity of these newspaper reporters, I don't think this would become the event afterwards that it did.
Right. And the other thing that we saw in the entire Serum Run is that the press and several of the players in this story were not above exaggerating things. They weren't above making things sound even more treacherous than they were, and sometimes inventing little stories that they knew would pique people's interest, because a lot of the players in this story, they wanted to keep people invested in it, and they wanted to make sure that, for example, if there were more resources that were needed, that there would be a public outcry if the resources weren't provided. So we see a little bit of the kind of manipulation of media that, we've come to kind of maybe grown immune to in these days. But that's one of the first big stories where that happened.
And you know, as you say that, it still happens today in mushing, doesn't it? That little bit of a romanticism in how all of us mushers have these stories from the trail and all of this, you know, larger than life stuff that happens to us. That's what is so drawn not only to the Iditarod and the Yukon Quest, but even a show like ours. People just love to hear the stories, and we try our best to make sure everything that we say has actually happened, but that still happens every day in the mushing world, doesn't it?
It sure does. And I have to confess that as a storyteller and as someone who loves stories and loves telling stories and loves hearing stories, I'm sometimes guilty of that over romanticizing of some of these events. But one of the things that I'm reminded of, both in the Serum Run and in our regular race coverage and Iditarod coverage, is there's really no need to exaggerate most of this stuff, because if you look at what mushers do on a daily basis, and especially mushers in long distance or mid distance events, it's pretty heroic already. We don't have to exaggerate it.
Right. So getting back to the story of the dogs and the two gentlemen there, for folks that don't know, Togo went on to live out his days, and he is currently, I don't know what the proper word for it is, I guess it's just stuffed. His body is stuffed and is on display at the Iditarod headquarters here in Wasilla, right down the road from us, and you know the place where all of the business side of Iditarod takes place. He's right there in the media room, so to speak. I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting story because after the Serum Run, Seppala eventually would move to Fairbanks, and then he split part of his time between Fairbanks and Maine, where he established a kennel and bred a lot of huskies, and really many of the huskies that are in the lower 48 can be traced back to that kennel that he had up in Maine. And when Togo died, which was in Maine, Seppala had him stuffed, essentially, and Togo's body was on display in a couple of different museums. And one of the museums where he was, before the stuffed body was brought to Alaska, they let everyone who came in touch the stuffed body and touch his coat. And as a result, the coat got a little bit discolored, as you can imagine, from thousands of people touching it over a period of many years. And it was eventually there was a letter writing campaign, I believe, and to bring Togo or the stuffed body of Togo back to Alaska, and that's why Togo has been at the Iditarod, at the ITC headquarters for many years, many decades. Interestingly enough, his skeleton. So when they stuffed him, they took the bones out, and his skeleton is in a museum in New Haven, Connecticut, a museum associated with Yale University.
Wow, I did not know that part of the story. That's pretty cool. I think even for mushers and geneticists of sled dogs, that would be something cool to see the confirmation of a dog like that, because he truly was an exceptional sled dog from way back in the day. So I imagine people today even think about how can we get a dog to react or act or mush or drive or whatever you want to call it to a magnificent animal like the lions of Seppala.
Right. And not to get too far into the science fiction element of this, but if you consider that there's a lot of things that go into an extraordinary dog and an extraordinary lead dog. But I have to wonder in the back of my mind, well, if you could get a little of that DNA, or if you could get like a little chip of Togo's, one of Togo's bones, would you want to clone that dog and maybe bring him back in 2019?
We had an episode about that, didn't we, Alex? Just a couple of months ago about that genetic modification and the gene doping and all that. What a feat that would be to take a little bit of one of those dogs and introduce that into your lines. They're already doing it. They're saving they're saving DNA strands and genes and all that stuff from their current super dogs, as they call them. Imagine if they did that from a dog that's been dead almost 100 years.
Yeah. And, one more thing I wanted to mention about Leonhard Seppala is that in 1932, when the Winter Olympics, the third Winter Olympics were being held in Lake Placid, sled dog racing was an exhibition sport, a demonstration sport. And there were 12 teams who competed, all from the U.S. and from Canada. And I believe they went about 22 miles in one direction and then came back, I believe, the following day. And in that competition, Seppala came in second. And it's very interesting looking at the list of people who were finishers in that event in 1932. Number 11 of 12 is Colonel Norman Vaughan, who I know we'll talk about a little bit more next week. But it strikes me that Norman Vaughan is one of these characters who just pops up, almost like Woody Allen's Zelig. When you least expect him, there's Norman Vaughan somewhere in history.
Yeah, that is such a cool story. And of course, that plays right into something we're going to talk about next week when Norman Vaughan, I guess it was in the late 90s or so, started the Serum Run expedition up here in Alaska. He was one of the founders or chairman or whatever his official title of that became, and ended up having a reenactment, so to speak, traveling the same trail and carrying the serum and all that. And I'm anxious to tell that part of the story as well. And of course, we've talked about Colonel Vaughan several times about how he became an Iditarod musher and all that through history. So everything ties together a little bit, doesn't it, Alex?
It really does. And and we'll get more into this next week, I'm sure, but there is sometimes a little bit of, I don't know, a controversy about whether or not the Iditarod celebrates the Serum Run or not. And I've had arguments with people who know so much more about mushing than I will ever know, who come down very, very heavily on one side or the other. But whatever the facts of that are, it's very clear that the 1925 Serum Run was a very, very important event, not only for saving all of the people in Nome and preventing this really potentially catastrophic outbreak, but also in terms of making people much more aware of sled dogs and of Alaska and of, traveling in the wilderness in Alaska. And so I think that's something that I always come back to.
And I think that leads a little bit to that romanticism part of the story as well. When you can tie something back to, some cool romantic event like the Serum Run, a life-saving event where, they literally saved hundreds of lives, and then somehow bring that back full circle to an event like the Iditarod. I think that really goes into the story playing.
Yeah, and that's I'll be the first to admit that's a large part of what inspires me about the Iditarod and about mushing, is that I feel that there is a deep connection to a lot of these events, not only the Serum Run, but also for me, when I look at people going out in the middle of the night behind a dog team, it reminds me that people have been traveling by dog sled for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years.
And you know what, Alex? I know you and I talked about this offline this morning. You and I have hosted this show 4, 5, 6 years together now, and we had mentioned at the top that you're coming up to be part of the Iditarod festivities, and we're going to get you out here and get you on your first sled run here at our kennel. So I guess you're going to have a little bit of that experience or that romanticism yourself to look back upon when you're hosting your future shows.
Yes, and I look forward to the many, many pictures of me having wiped out and be like next to the sled that's on its side, just covered with snow.
And there you have it. The rest of the story about our series, the 1925 Serum Run, here on Mushing Radio. Next week, we're going to talk about some of the events that happened after the Serum Run, including the Iditarod, the 1932 Winter Olympics Exposition. We're also going to talk about the newer version of the Serum Run that was started by Norman Vaughan in the late 90s, early 2000s, and how they paid homage to the events of 1925. So please stay tuned. We'll talk to you guys next time. Goodbye. Alex, how's it going?
It's going great, Robert. Very excited that we are almost at Iditarod time, just a few more weeks. We are pulling past the Yukon quest, which is still going on, but we have a winner in the quest, and it's just a very exciting time for mushing.
It is an exciting time, and on today's show, we're going to tell you the rest of the story after our Serum Run series here on Mushing Radio. Last week, we talked about Balto and Togo and sort of the events that led up to their lives after the big event, the Serum Run event. But now we're going to talk about some of the things that happened aside from the Serum Run, sort of the lead up to it. We're going to talk about the Olympics, the Iditarod, and all that, right?
Absolutely. And, it's I've been watching a lot of the current Winter Olympics, and it's a very exciting thing to watch a lot of these events. But I think I am with you in that I would still love to see dog sled racing as an Olympic event, either an exhibition event or a full medal event.
They had an exposition event back in 1932, and I know we talked a little bit about that on the rest of the story, part 1, just last week, where Leonhard Seppala and Norman Vaughan, those sort of folks were running in that event. And it was, like we said, just an exposition type event up in Lake Placid in New York. It was more of a sprint race, and it was pretty well thought upon. A lot of people really wanted that to be involved, but I don't think it was just the right time. We were just coming out of the Depression and all that sort of stuff, and to add in other sports and of course sports like mushing, which is a much more in-depth type sport than more of the single type sports that you will often find in the Winter Olympics. Typically it's a one-person deal with the skiing and that sort of thing, not necessarily with teams as you are in other events. And if you add dogs, that's an entirely different deal.
Right. And, I think that it was very well thought of. And if things had been a little bit different, if there had been like a little bit more, economic prosperity and things like that, I think it would have been a very different deal. And I think that, in the 30s, as people were really, really suffering, it sort of became, I think, something that was seen as a little bit frivolous to get, hundreds or thousands of dogs and transport them all over the world when people were starving.
Right, and what's interesting with that is my neighbor just up the road, the Norrises, J.P. Norris's father, Earl Norris, and his wife, Natalie, were just getting started in mushing in the late 30s, I guess it was, with Siberian Huskies. And that's sort of interesting with this because, of course, Leonhard Seppala was the one that introduced most of America to the Siberian Husky as it is known today. And here in Alaska, it was Earl and Natalie Norris that did that, and, of course, introduced them to quite a bit of mushing in our local community. And it's interesting, Alex, because I know I've told you this story before, but their dog kennel was in the middle of downtown Anchorage, right where the Sears Mall is right now. And I think that's really cool because now that is, covered in, a major metropolitan area. And back in the day, that's where a major sled dog kennel was.
That's pretty amazing. And it's Anchorage, for people who haven't been there, is a very interesting and kind of large in area city, and it's really spread out. But that is pretty close to, it's not downtown, but it's pretty close to the center of town.
Right. And just sort of bringing that forward, Earl and Natalie's granddaughter, Lisbeth Norris, is still an Iditarod competitor. I guess she's ran in the last 3 or 4 races with her teams of Siberians, so it can really be tied back to way back in the day, right after the Serum Run, within a decade or so of when their kennel started. So I think that history is sort of a true testament back to the Serum Run days.
Absolutely. And, as time went on and as, the 40s and 50s and 60s were rolling on, we really saw in Alaska a lot of people moving away from using sled dogs in traditional ways, and people starting to use snow machines and starting to use airplanes for things like mail delivery. And so there was a period of several decades where it was starting to look like the sled dogs and the use of sled dogs in Alaska was going to disappear.
Right, there wasn't nearly the focus on distance mushing in that sort of time in those decades of the 40s and 50s. Of course, sprint mushing was still big. A lot of the villagers here in Alaska would use sprint mushing as sort of a entertainment activity that spend their weeks doing their jobs, whether it was hauling gear and trap lines and sort of stuff using dog teams, and then they would all get together and run mushing events in the weekends, and they would sort of claim prizes about who had the fastest dogs and that sort of thing. And then folks like Roland Lombard would come up from the lower 48, in particular in the New England area, and would run the Fur Rondy and the North American and just clean house with his dogs. And that sort of brought a wider audience. It became a more of a national type audience versus just more of an Alaskan audience. And then we worked our way in towards a little bit more of the distance type mushing events, with the advent of the Iditarod. And I know you want to talk a little bit about that.
Right. And, we tend to look at the Iditarod as being something that's that just kind of appeared, but there actually was many, many years where the Reddingtons were trying to put this race together, and it started out as a way of trying to honor the role of the sled dog in Alaska. And there's a little bit of kind of controversy about whether the Iditarod only honors sled dogs in Alaska, or whether the Iditarod specifically is meant to honor the 1925 Serum Run. And people go back and forth about this, and I've been lectured by people who know a lot more than I do on both sides of the issue.
Right.
But certainly, you can't look at the history of sled dogs in Alaska and ignore the Serum Run, because it was such an important event, and it did take place largely along the historic Iditarod Trail.
Right, and I think I agree with you. I've sort of been on both sides of that argument many a times, and there's so many parallels to the Iditarod and the Serum Run. Of course, it starts in Anchorage. It started by train with the Serum Run and ended up in Nenana and worked its way around, and then of course ends in Nome. There has to be a reason why that event, the Iditarod, ends in Nome. I guess they could have ended it anywhere. Kotzebue or anywhere if they would have just put in a new trail, I guess. But yeah, I think there is sort of the romanticism along with the Serum Run and Iditarod and tying them together, just sort of that world of sled dogs and how they are sort of just a force in the north and, bringing a community together that way. And with that, before we talk about the Iditarod in its current day, just a couple of years ago, was it last year that the Iditarod started in Fairbanks, and they ran pretty much on the same trail that they ran the Serum Run on from Fairbanks on over to Huslia and Ruby and that sort of thing before hooking up with the current Iditarod trail at the Yukon River and working its way up, which is pretty much the same trail in both events. Is that right?
Right. And, one thing I wanted to mention real quickly is that when the Iditarod was first being conceived, one of the initial ideas for it was to go about halfway, to go approximately to the village of Iditarod, and then turn back and just come back to Anchorage. And it was in the course of planning that Joe Reddington and a bunch of the other early people involved with the first Iditarod decided that it would be much more romantic and would really get people's attention a lot more if they went all the way to Nome rather than going halfway and then turning around and coming back.
So I guess the Iditarod planning started in the late 60s or so, and it was a really short race back in the day. I guess they were just running more of almost a sprint race, wasn't it? Just right around here in Knik was the first couple of races with those folks, and they were just getting their feet wet and figuring out logistics and that sort of thing.
Right. I believe the first race that sort of evolved into Iditarod was in I want to say 1967 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the first All-Alaska sweepstakes.
Right. And that definitely want to talk about that as we progress through our decades as well, because that, that becomes an important one in regards to Leonhard Seppala, and he was a multi-winner with that as well. So I guess the Iditarod started, what was it, 1973 or 74?
Right. The first Iditarod was 73.
And it was definitely a much different race than it is today. It was more of a camping trip. Took several weeks to get from Anchorage to Nome. There wasn't nearly the field or the competitors that we have today. The dogs were much different back in the day. They weren't nearly as fast as they are today. They were much more husky type dogs. The gear was different. The sleds were different. The trail was not nearly as well groomed as it is today. And it was just much more of a slower race back then than it is today.
Yeah, and when they were first running the initial Iditarod, many of the people involved, including many of the mushers, were not sure that it was actually possible to do this. They were not sure that anyone was going to finish. So there was much more of a spirit of cooperation, and it was really first an adventure and then only secondarily a race. I want to correct myself with something I just said. The 1967 race was to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the purchase of Alaska.
Gotcha.
Not the All-Alaska Sweepstakes. So I misspoke there.
That's okay. So then, as we're working our way through the decades, the Iditarod chugs along. It becomes much more of a race-type event. The competitors began running the race much faster. The purse went up. The sponsors came in. And, of course, it became a much more viewer-friendly event, I guess it would be. The newspapers picked it up, and, of course, cable and TV and all of that. And then in there, we also had that Alaska sweepstakes, the All-Alaska Sweepstakes, and they ran that a few times. I guess that was in the, what is it, the early 2000s, late 1990s. Do you know that exactly, Alex?
I'll get it in a sec. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So anyway, the All-Alaska Sweepstakes was run in the Nome area, so out that way, not on the road system as as the Iditarod was, and that is tied right back to the days of the Serum Run with Leonhard Seppala. He won that race several times back in the 1920s or so, and proved to be a force to be reckoned with out there. And of course, they brought that back, and folks like Mitch Seavey ran it. I think Jeff King has ran that as well. Sort of the who's who of mushing today has ran in that race as well. Are you there, Alex?
Yeah, they ran it. Yeah, they ran it in 1983 for the 75th anniversary, and Rick Swenson won that year. And then they ran it again in 2008 for the 100th anniversary, and Mitch Seavey won that race. And one of the things that characterized that race also is it was a winner take all. So, the person who won got all of the prize money. So if you were second, you got a thank you and I believe dinner.
And if I'm correct, I believe you had to finish with all of your dogs in harness. Is that true?
I am not sure about that. That may be true.
I know that there's been some talk about that with the current Iditarod and sort of the ability to drop dogs along the trail. And if they went back to the All-Alaskan Sweepstakes days, I believe they had a rule that you had to finish the race with all of the dogs that you started with, which would make for a very interesting racing environment back then as it would today. So tying this back to the Olympics in the late 90s or so, Norman Vaughan, who was not only a polar explorer and an Iditarod racer, but also one of the folks that ran back in that 1932 Winter Olympic Exposition event with Leonhard Seppala and those guys. He ran in that Olympics, but then he came up and he did a Serum Run, commemorative run, or an expedition that traced the original Serum Run route, and that went on for several years. What do you know about that?
The Norman Vaughan Serum Run 25 was to commemorate the Serum Run, and Norman Vaughan is a very inspirational figure for me and a lot of other people. His motto was "Dream big and dare to fail," and he was someone who was still mushing dogs, who was running Iditarod well up into his 80s, I believe, who did the Serum Run expedition several times, including when he was well into his 90s. What they did for the Serum Run expeditions is they would have mushers and snow machiners. So there would be generally somewhere around a dozen, between 7 and a dozen mushers, and then snow machiners who would be on their teams hauling gear for them, and they would follow the original 1925 Serum Run route and stop at all of these villages. So rather than taking a few days as the Serum Run did, or a few weeks as the early Iditarods did, these trips would generally last about 3 weeks. And in each of the villages, there would be an educational component. So there was a theme for each of these expeditions. And they would go into these villages and do presentations about this particular theme. So it was a way of both reconnecting with the villagers and reconnecting with, in a lot of cases, a way of life that is much more traditional. And also there was a very strong educational component to them.
Right, and they also carried a box of serum, whether that serum would be vaccinations for dogs in the villages or sort of a commemorative box. And each day on the Serum Run, they would pass that box of Serum Run from one musher to the next, and they would sort of be the Serum Run musher of the day, and they would be in charge of making sure the serum made it correctly or safely to the next musher, which is pretty cool as well. You know, that the last time they ran that event was in 2014. I was part of that. I was working with friends of mine here in the neighborhood, and they were the organizers of that, and I helped train for that and went up to Nenana and helped them get off. And, you know, we've been talking for several years about getting that going again. My friends who are the organizers have gotten out of dogs at this point and have gone on to do other things. But I've talked to many people about getting that event back up and running again. I think that would be a great way to pay homage to not only to the Serum Run, but of course dogs and that way of life as they work their way down the trail. So you don't know. Maybe we'll do that in the near future. I think it would be a cool way to get out there and see the trail. And speaking of that, Alex, I know that you talked about it several times in our coverage here on our show about sort of the old stories that are left, with the mushers. I think just about all of them now, of course, have passed on. If not, they would be really close to 100 years old or more. Is there anybody still alive that did the Serum Run? I don't think so. They would be well over 100 now, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I don't believe there is either, because that's 90, 94, 93 years ago we're talking about. So yeah, unfortunately, a lot of them are gone. But what is lucky is that there was a concerted effort in the last 30 years or so to get the stories from these mushers who were part of the early Serum Run. And one of the cool things about Alaska is that in relative terms, Alaska is a very new area, very new state. So I have a friend who is very active in politics and was saying that it's great to be involved in politics in Alaska because literally the people who founded the state are for the most part still around. Now that probably won't be the case in 10 or 20 years, but right now they are. And in the same way, back in the 80s and 90s, there was a concerted effort to capture the stories of these mushers while they were still around. And there are several archives that have oral histories and statements from a lot of the 1925 Serum Run mushers.
In your research for the series, were there a lot of voice recordings?
I think there are a lot of voice recordings that are in Alaska. I wasn't able to come up with many of them that are online, but I believe that there are a bunch of them in various archives in Alaska.
I would love to hear some of those old stories from a lot of those folks. I know that a lot of those stories are still held in a lot of those families. They're still talked about in the oral history of Alaska, and I think that that's a very important part of not only our state's history, but of course the sports history as well, and the lifestyle history of mushing. And I know just a few years ago, I guess it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they did a documentary called Icebound about the Serum Run, and the writer, producer, and director Daniel Ankers was a guest on our sister show, The Side Vibe, with Dorothy Wills-Raftery. And unfortunately, right after it was released, I know he did the film festival up here in Alaska that you did, the Anchorage Film Festival. He passed away, I believe it was from cancer, so it didn't get a lot of hubbub or press after that because, it sort of passed along with him. Do you know much about that documentary at all?
I don't. I've heard it mentioned a number of times, but I have not seen it yet.
It's a good one. It does tell the stories, and there's some reenactments along the way, and it's a great way to introduce new people to this event in our history, which is, it's pretty cool because it really bridges the gap. And I know you told a lot of this in your series. It bridged the gap from sort of the old way of life up here in Alaska, and of course the old way of life in the United States, in how things were, sort of local community driven, and then all of a sudden national stories could be reported on, national stories that weren't necessarily, major impact stories like, the war and the economy and that sort of things in the newspaper. It was a feel-good story, and I think it was one of the first ways that a story could be told in that way, with the use of newspapers and that sort of thing, in ways that hadn't been done before. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's really important for people to pay attention to some of this history. And there are a lot of sources and a lot of stories that you can learn. And I think sometimes, especially with people who are, who are a little bit more reserved, and I think that's the case with a lot of the people involved with the Serum Run, is they maybe didn't realize how important and amazing what they did was, and they thought, oh, this is really just something that is another day's work, another activity that I did, and then I'll do something else tomorrow.
Right. So to end this whole process, Alex, we've been working on this since late into the fall, early into the fall. I guess we started working on it in late October or so. So to sort of sum everything up, why did you pick this story? And, I guess it was definitely a labor of love, but to finish this whole thing up, why did you pick this story and why did you want to tell it?
I think that this story, a lot of times when you have something that is tragic or that stems from a tragedy, you find that it brings out the best in people. And it seems lately like maybe we really need some pure good news. Maybe we really need something that is very inspirational and can make you think, well, maybe I'm never going to get behind a dog team and go out when it's 70 below zero, but perhaps knowing that these things are possible and knowing that people did these will encourage people in facing whatever their particular challenges are. So I've always found that this is a very, very inspirational story, and wanted to share some of that and hope that it would inspire other people.
I keep coming back to that quote that you had in one of the earlier episodes. I don't remember who it is, and I don't remember exactly the quote itself, but something to the effect of, we've got to get going, people are dying, and the dog's got to go. Do you remember that quote?
Yeah, it's Wild Bill Shannon, who, when he got to Nenana, it was very, very cold, and it was the middle of the night, and he was asked if he wanted to wait until morning when it might have been more prudent and would be able to see better and it would be warmer. And he just said, if people are dying, let's get going.
Right. I think that sums up the whole story in itself. That is that story of perseverance, that story of helping out your fellow man, the story of sort of just going out there and tackling the unknown. There's so many parallels and so many metaphors just in that quote alone. I think is reason enough to tell that story here on Mushing Radio, and I'm glad we did it.
Yeah, me too. And it's been a real amazing process putting all of this together and getting so much amazing feedback from our listeners. And as usual, I want to encourage listeners who have, any comments or reactions, to share them with us. We're almost always available through social media.
And please be sure, if you liked it or if you didn't, leave us a review over on Apple Podcasts. That helps us out on the rankings and helps folks find our shows by having those reviews. They can learn about what the show is about. So please leave some comments there, whether it's a 1-star or a 5-star. We would like to hear from you as well. So I look forward to season 2, whenever that's going to happen. Hopefully that happens here in 2018. We'll start to get to work on that relatively soon. And until then, we will be back on our regular coverage here on Mushing Radio. Alex and I typically do every couple of weeks here on the show, and we talk about all sorts of topics in the off season, whether it be racing or news or events that are upgoing. And I know we've had a heck of a lot of events this past year, and it's been good to have sort of a sounding board for that, not only for ourselves but for our listeners as well. We're a little bit different than your typical media because we have not only a fan but also a musher along as well. So I think we have a very balanced perspective in our coverage of not only the current events but also Iditarod and that sort of thing. So Alex, it has been a pleasure working with you on Season 1 here on Mushing Radio, talking about the 1925 Serum Run. Anything you want to mention in closing?
Literally this morning, I was looking at an article that I found, which I guess this happened last year. I didn't see it when it happened last year, but apparently there was an exhibition at the Anchorage Museum where they brought up the body of Balto, which is usually in Cleveland, and it was on loan to the Anchorage Museum, and they brought Togo from the Iditarod headquarters, and they had Togo and Balto, or the stuffed bodies of Togo and Balto, in this one place in Anchorage for about 3 months during this exhibition, and that was very cool to see.
So there you go, guys. Full circle. Things are still happening in our history that revolve around the 1925 Serum Run. So stay tuned here to Mushing Radio. We're happy to have you along, and we will see you guys next time. Goodbye.